Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. The storm had been relentless, hammering the landscape with a fury that made the trees sway like trembling giants. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white against the darkness of the night. Outside, the rain came, down in sheets so thick that it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Her windshield wipers struggled to keep pace, the rhythmic screech of rubber against glass adding to the symphony of nature's rage. The road twisted through the heart of Cherokee National Forest, and Sarah cursed herself for not having turned back earlier. She had known the storm was coming, of course, but she had hoped to outrun it. Her cabin, nestled deep in the woods, was a sanctuary, a place she could escape to from the noise of the world. But tonight, it felt more like a prison, as if the storm itself was conspiring to keep her from reaching it. Her phone had lost signal hours ago, and now all she had was the sound of her own breathing and the relentless pounding of the rain. She glanced at the gas gauge, nearly empty. The nearest town was at least another hour's drive, and that was if the roads held out. She sighed in frustration, wiping her face with one hand. The headlights flickered. A warning. "Come on," she muttered under her breath, jiggling the steering wheel as the engine sputtered. The car lurched, but it seemed to keep going. For now, the bridge was just ahead. Sarah had driven this route countless times over the years. The old bridge was a relic of a forgotten era, made of rotting wood and rusting iron, barely wide enough for two cars to pass. She'd crossed it in rainstorms, in snow, in the dead of night. Nothing had ever stopped her. Not until now. As she neared the bridge, the sound of rushing water grew louder, filling her ears, drowning out everything else. The river, usually a calm, tranquil flow, was now a violent force, churning, swelling, and threatening to consume everything in its path. The bridge appeared out of the mist, its old wooden planks creaking under the weight of the floodwaters. The river had risen so high that only the top half of the bridge was visible, its stone supports barely peeking above the surface. Sarah slowed the car, her breath catching in her throat. She stopped, her eyes tracing the edge of the bridge. The floodwaters had already reached the bottom of the guardrails, and the road beyond was invisible, swallowed whole by the dark, swirling mass of water. Her heart pounded. The bridge was impassable. She couldn't drive across it. But where could she go? The storm had closed off the other roads, and the GPS was useless, flashing a no-signal warning in bold red letters. The car idled, its engine humming softly beneath her, and Sarah looked around in frustration. There was no sign of another car, no indication that anyone else had made it this far. It was just her, alone, in the middle of nowhere. Then, through the torrential downpour, she saw him. A figure stood at the center of the bridge, his silhouette barely visible through the rain. She blinked, wondering if she was seeing things. The figure was tall, almost unnaturally so, and he was standing perfectly still, staring directly at her. At first, Sarah thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps her eyes playing games with her in the storm. But the figure didn't move. He was dressed in a dark, soaked uniform. A park ranger's uniform, she realized. His hat was pulled low over his face, shadowing his features. His posture was stiff, almost mechanical, as though he were waiting for something. Her pulse quickened. This was not normal. What would a ranger be doing out here, in the middle of a storm, standing on a flooded bridge with no vehicle in sight? She rolled down the window a crack, the cold wind rushing in, biting at her skin. She tried to call out to him, but the words were lost in the howling wind. "Hello?" she shouted, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you all right?" The man didn't respond at first. He simply stood there, still as a statue. Sarah's anxiety crept up her spine like a shadow, cold and unwelcome. "Hey!" she called again, but the man still didn't budge. Her eyes flickered to the rear-view mirror. There was no way around the bridge. The floodwaters had claimed both sides of the road, and backing up into the storm seemed just as impossible. The only choice was to keep waiting for the storm to pass, waiting for a sign. But something deep within her stirred, a sense of unease that wouldn't let go. Finally, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his arm and waved. Sarah's breath hitched. Something about the motion felt wrong, like it wasn't quite human. But then, as if to reassure herself, she rolled the window down just a little bit further, enough to catch his voice as it cut through the storm, clear and monotonous. "You don't want to go that way," he said. The words were soft, unnervingly calm. Sarah's stomach tightened. She leaned forward in the seat, her hand still gripping the wheel as she stared at him, trying to make out his face beneath the brim of his soaked hat. "What?" she asked, barely able to hear herself over the storm. "What do you mean? What's going on with the bridge?" The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, his gaze seemed to pierce through her, as if he could see into her very soul. The silence stretched on, and Sarah's heart began to beat faster. The storm raged around them, but it felt as though the world had gone still, as if time itself had stopped. Then, without warning, the man spoke again. "You don't want to go that way," he repeated, his voice unwavering, almost mechanical. Sarah's pulse quickened, the words settling into her chest like lead. She stared at him, feeling her pulse in her throat. This wasn't right. None of it was right. She reached for her phone, desperate to find an alternate route, but the signal was dead, the screen flashing an error message. Her grip tightened on the phone as the storm intensified, the rain now hitting the car with a deafening fury. When she looked up again, the man was gone. Just like that. One moment, he had been there, standing in the center of the bridge, and the next, he was simply gone. Not a single movement, not a sound to mark his departure. Sarah blinked, rubbing her eyes, wondering if it had all been a hallucination, a trick of the storm. But no, she couldn't deny the feeling of unease that lingered in her chest, the eerie absence of the man where he had been just moments before. Her hands shook as she started the engine, the car sputtering as it rumbled. Back to life. She backed away from the bridge, her eyes scanning the road behind her. But there was no sign of anyone. The man was gone. The bridge was empty. The only thing left was the sound of the storm and the churning water beneath her. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling. It had followed her, clung to her like the damp clothes she had discarded as soon as she entered the cabin. The storm had passed, but the unease was still heavy, settling into the hollow of her chest. She had driven the winding roads back to her cabin, trying to force her mind to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe the storm had played tricks on her. Maybe she'd been so tired, so caught up in the frustration of the night, that her mind had conjured up an image of a park ranger. But no. The clarity of the man's voice, the stillness of his presence, refused to fade into nothingness. The world outside was quiet now. The wind had stilled, and only the faint hum of the rain tapping against the windows remained. She sat in the darkened living room of her cabin, her legs tucked beneath her as she stared into the fire flickering lazily in the hearth. The cabin, usually so cozy and comforting, now felt distant and foreign. The wooden beams above her head seemed to press down on her, as if the walls themselves were closing in. She had always come here for peace, to escape the noise of the city, to heal from the deep, unspoken grief that had followed her for months. But tonight, the silence felt suffocating. The warmth of the fire, the soft crackling of the logs, did nothing to soothe the raw, gnawing sensation in her gut. Sarah stood and paced the length of the room, her eyes constantly flicking to the windows. Every sound outside seemed amplified in the stillness. A branch creaked under the weight of the remaining water on its leaves. An owl hooted in the distance. But even those sounds, natural as they were, made her pulse quicken. She couldn't stop thinking about the bridge. The man's warning, the strange emptiness of his voice, the way he had appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as suddenly, and that overwhelming feeling that there was something more to him, something that she couldn't quite understand. She hadn't wanted to acknowledge it before, but now she couldn't ignore it any longer. There was a presence, a sense of foreboding that hung in the air, and it was growing stronger with each passing minute. Sarah had grown up in these woods. She knew the terrain well, the old legends that passed from one generation to the next. But there were things that even the locals didn't talk about. Things that lurked in the shadows of these forests, forgotten by time, but never truly gone. Old stories, tales about spirits that haunted the roads, about bridges that led nowhere but to doom. But those were just stories, right? The question seemed absurd, but Sarah couldn't help but wonder if there was something to them. Her eyes drifted to the small bookshelf by the door, the leather-bound journals of her late mother resting there, gathering dust. Her mother had known this land inside and out. The old woman had often spoken of the hidden dangers, the places where the earth remembered old wounds and cried out with strange voices. But Sarah had always dismissed it, chalking it up to folklore, a way of dealing with the unexplained. Yet, now, in the quiet, oppressive night, she felt the weight of those stories pressing down on her. The storm outside had passed, but the rain was still coming in heavy sheets, tapping against the windows like restless fingers. A shiver ran down her spine as she stared out into the darkness, where the shadows of the trees seemed to pulse and shift. Every flicker of movement in the corner of her eye made her heart race. The man, the ranger, had warned her. But what had he meant? What danger was there beyond that bridge? A soft sound from the kitchen snapped her out of her thoughts. A gentle knock. It wasn't from the storm. It wasn't a branch hitting the side of the house. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Who would be knocking at her door at this hour? The storm had isolated her, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. No one would be out here in this weather, certainly not at this late hour. Her pulse quickened, and she moved cautiously toward the door, each step echoing in the quiet cabin. She couldn't make out who or what was standing beyond the glass. The world outside was a thick blur of darkness and rain. She hesitated before reaching for the handle, her fingers trembling. The knock came again, sharp and deliberate. Slowly, she opened the door just a crack. The cold air rushed in, chilling her face. She peered out into the dark, but there was nothing. No person, no shape standing in the shadows. Just the relentless rain, the wet earth, and the whisper of wind through the trees. Her breath caught, a chill running through her as she stepped further into the doorway. The night stretched out before her, infinite and unnerving. She scanned the surroundings, still nothing. Then she saw it. A small piece of paper was pinned to the wooden frame of the door, a damp corner fluttering in the breeze. Sarah reached for it cautiously, pulling it free, and her fingers froze as she saw the writing. A simple phrase, scrawled in neat, precise letters. You were warned. A jolt of terror surged through her, cold and swift. She could barely breathe as she stared at the words. She didn't know who had written them or how they had gotten there, but it didn't matter. The message was clear. The warning wasn't just for the bridge, it was for her, for something that was coming for her. Without thinking, She crumpled the paper in her hand and stepped back into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind her. Her heart was thundering in her chest, and the sudden rush of adrenaline made her dizzy. Was it the man from the bridge? Had he come after her? She tried to steady her breath, but the air in the cabin felt thick, suffocating. The stillness of the room pressed in on her, and the silence felt like an accusation. Something was wrong. Something was already happening. Suddenly, a faint sound broke through the quiet. A rustle. A whisper. It seemed to be coming from the other side of the room. Sarah's head snapped toward the source of the noise. The bookshelf. Her mother's journals. The pages had started to turn. Slowly they flipped, one by one, each turning with the gentlest of sounds, as if a breeze were passing over them. But there was no wind. Her pulse raced again, the sound of the pages turning loud in her ears, deafening. The room seemed to constrict around her as she took a hesitant step forward, her feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. She reached the bookshelf, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The journal that had been resting at the end of the row was now open, its pages flipping on their own, and there, on the open page, a single word was written in the faded ink, bold and clear. Help. Her eyes widened, and the air seemed to grow colder around her, heavy with the scent of mildew and the weight of things long buried. She backed away slowly, her hand reaching for the door, her heart thumping in her chest. A shadow moved across the wall. The shadow on the wall shifted again, the edges jagged and unsettling as if it had a life of its own, stretching unnaturally long across the room. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat, the cold air suddenly pressing in on her like the hand of some unseen force. Her feet felt glued to the floor, frozen by a mixture of dread and disbelief. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, an almost deafening sound that seemed to reverberate in the stillness of the room. It wasn't just the shadow. It was the silence. That oppressive, suffocating quiet that pressed down on her, making every small sound, every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind outside seem louder, more significant. Sarah's eyes never left the space where the shadow had moved. She took a small step back, her fingers brushing against the edge of the bookshelf, hoping for something, anything, that would snap her out of the paralytic fear slowly creeping up her spine. And then, from the corner of her vision, she saw a figure standing just inside the doorway to the kitchen. Her blood turned to ice. The man, the ranger. But this time he wasn't standing still. This time his form was more defined, more real. She could see the soaked uniform clinging to his body, the way his boots squelched with each step he took. His hat was pulled lower, the brim casting his face in shadow. But Sarah could feel his gaze on her, even without seeing his eyes. It was as if he were looking straight into her soul. She stumbled back, her heart slamming against her ribcage. No, this isn't real, she whispered to herself, shaking her head, trying to banish the vision from her mind. You're just imagining things. The man stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, each step filling the silence like the ticking of a clock winding down to some inevitable conclusion. The atmosphere seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, the weight of the air pressing down on Sarah's chest, making it hard to breathe. The fire in the hearth crackled loudly, as though protesting the unnatural quiet. And then he spoke, his voice low, almost mechanical. The same monotone she had heard on the bridge. You should not have come here. His words sent a cold shiver down her spine. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. What do you want from me? What is this? She could barely hear her own voice over the thunderous pounding of her heartbeat. The man didn't answer immediately. He took another step forward, his wet, darkened uniform glistening in the low light. He was closer now, so close that Sarah could feel the chill emanating from him, a coldness that wasn't of the storm. It was as if the air around him had turned to ice. You should not have gone to the bridge, he said again, his voice softer now, but still carrying that same eerie resonance. "It calls to you. It always has." His words sent a ripple of confusion through Sarah's mind. She took a cautious step backward, nearly stumbling over the edge of the coffee table, her eyes never leaving him. What do you mean?" she whispered. Her pulse was frantic now, her breath shallow, each inhale an effort. The man didn't move, but his gaze seemed to pierce her, his presence expanding until the entire room felt crowded with him, suffocating her. "The bridge is not just wood and stone," he said. "It is a door to something else." The air in the room seemed to thicken with these words, as if the very walls themselves were listening, waiting for something to unfold. Sarah felt a deep sense of vertigo, as if the ground beneath her feet was shifting. She wanted to scream, to run, but she was trapped. Her body refused to obey her, her limbs frozen in place, as if bound by an invisible force. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch toward her, elongating like dark tendrils reaching for her skin. The man tilted his head, his face still hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but she could feel the weight of his gaze pressing against her skull. The faintest hint of movement came from beneath the shadow, something subtle, like the slightest shift in his posture, but it was enough to send a wave of nausea rushing through Sarah. There was something wrong with him, something deeply wrong. "You were warned," he said, his voice now barely more than a whisper, though it still seemed to echo in the silence. "You shouldn't have ignored it." Suddenly the room felt smaller, as though the walls were closing in, tightening around her like a vice. The fire in the hearth flickered, the flames sputtering and dimming for just a moment before roaring back to life, casting the man's silhouette into sharp contrast against the shifting shadows. His presence was suffocating, oppressive. "Leave now," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as her body finally found the strength to move. Even if it was only a small step back, she needed to leave, needed to escape. The man's lips curled, though she couldn't see his face clearly enough to know whether it was a smile or a grimace. But something about the way the shadows pooled around him made her skin crawl. "You can't leave," he said simply, as if the answer were as obvious as the air she breathed. "You never left, did you? You've been here before." Her heart stopped. The words felt like a punch to the gut. She stumbled backward, her eyes darting wildly around the room, her mind racing. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I haven't been here before. I've never been here before." But the words felt hollow even as they left her mouth, a part of her, already questioning the truth of her own memories. The man didn't speak for a long while. The silence stretched out between them like a yawning chasm, but Sarah could feel him watching, waiting for her to understand something she couldn't yet grasp. "Everything has a price," he said finally, his voice low, the words hanging in the air like a curse. "And this place, it always takes." Sarah's stomach turned, and the walls of the cabin seemed to close in even tighter. She wanted to scream, to run, but the air was thick with something darker, something heavy. The storm outside had passed, but something far worse had taken its place. The man took one more step toward her, and the shadows around him seemed to respond, curling and twisting as if they were alive. His voice, when it came again, was quieter, almost a sigh. "The bridge is waiting for you," he said softly, and with those words, the shadows rushed forward. In the blink of an eye, he was gone, but the room still felt heavy, still felt crowded. Sarah could still feel the presence, the oppressive weight of something else in the room with her. Something ancient, something that had been waiting. The room felt wrong. The air, thick with the remnants of the man's presence, hung heavy around Sarah like a wet blanket. She could feel the oppressive weight of it on her skin, crawling beneath her flesh, making every small movement feel slow and deliberate, as though the very atmosphere was holding her in place. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth now distant and faint, as if it too were retreating from the unsettling cold that had settled around her. The shadows cast by, the flickering flames stretched and twisted unnaturally, reaching toward her like fingers made of darkness, but the room was still, too still. The sensation that something else was present, something just outside her perception, was undeniable. Sarah's breath was shallow. The pulse in her neck beat like a drum, its rhythm erratic. Each thump a reminder of how close she had come to the edge of whatever was unfolding. Her legs wobbled beneath her as she stumbled back into the living room, her eyes darting to the door, to the windows, to any possible escape. But she didn't move. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the mantle, grounding her, forcing her to focus. She was losing herself to the fear, the terror of what had happened. The man, the warning, the feeling that the world was tilting beneath her feet. She needed answers. She needed to understand what the hell was going on. But the answers felt just out of reach. She turned, her gaze falling on the bookshelf again. Her mother's journals, her mother's voice, was still lingering there, faint but persistent, like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. Something about it pulled at her. Something deep in her gut told her that these journals held more than just her mother's musings. They held the key to what was happening. Sarah crossed the room slowly, her fingers trembling as she reached for the journal her mother had always kept closest. It was worn, its leather cover cracked from years of use, but it felt oddly comforting in her hands. She flipped it open, her breath catching as she found an entry dated years ago, an entry that spoke of something she had never heard before. The deity bridge, an old curse. Her fingers skimmed the words. The ink faded but legible, each letter sinking into her like a cold whisper. The bridge. It stands between worlds. The land calls to it, and the land answers. The water holds memories. Memories that stretch back to a time before the trees grew tall and the rivers flowed clean. There are those who cross seeking answers, but few ever return. Those who do, well, they are never the same. They bring something back with them, something that waits, something that watches. Sarah's heart skipped. She paused, rereading the words. Her mother had known. She had known more than she had ever told Sarah, more than Sarah could ever imagine. But before Sarah could go any further, the lights flickered. The room darkened for a moment, and then, just as quickly, the dim light returned. A soft tapping came from the kitchen. It was too subtle to be the wind, too deliberate. She hesitated, her throat tightening. The knocking was quiet at first, just a tap, tap, tap. But then it came again, louder this time, more insistent. It sounded like something, or someone, was trying to get her attention. Or maybe trying to get in. Her heart leapt into her throat, her breath caught in her chest. She couldn't stand it anymore. She had to know what was out there. Sarah moved toward the kitchen, her body moving almost on instinct now, her mind screaming at her to stop, to get out, but her feet kept moving. The knocking grew louder, almost frantic, echoing in her skull. The air grew colder as she approached the threshold, as if the walls themselves had exhaled something dark and unseen. When she reached the doorway, she didn't immediately see anything. No person, no figure standing in the shadows, just the kitchen. But then the floor creaked, a subtle, almost imperceptible sound. Something was in there with her. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the light switch. She flipped it, and the light buzzed to life, illuminating the kitchen in stark, sterile brightness. The room was empty, just as it had been before. Then her eyes landed on the sink. The faucet was on. Water ran freely from it, pouring over the edge of the basin and pooling on the floor, spreading like a stain across the tiles. She gasped, stepping back, her pulse leaping again in her chest. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't turned the faucet on. She hadn't even been in the kitchen since the storm had started. But there it was. The water pooled around her feet, and the soft gurgling of the drain sounded like a whisper in the silent room. Suddenly, there was a loud slam from behind her. Sarah spun around, her heart stopping as the living room door slammed shut on its own. A cold draft swirled through the room, carrying with it the faint scent of earth, of damp leaves, of something long buried. She could hear the wind outside picking up again, the storm rolling back in, but it was different now. The air was thick with something else, something old, something that shouldn't have been there. "Get out." The whisper came again, so soft, so faint, that she could barely hear it, but it was there, pressing against her, sinking into her bones. The voice wasn't her own. She whipped around, looking for the source, but there was nothing. Then the shadow moved. It was subtle at first, a shift at the edge of her vision, but when she looked directly at it, the shadow grew, spreading across the room, reaching for her like a living thing. Her pulse quickened. The darkness was no longer just darkness. It was alive. She stumbled back into the hallway, her feet slipping on the wet tiles beneath her. Her hands reached out for anything, grabbing onto the walls, the doorframe. Her eyes darted around, but everything felt unreal. The edges of the room seemed to blur, the walls stretching out in impossible directions, and there, at the far end of the hall, she saw it. A figure, cloaked in shadow, standing motionless in the doorway. Its form was almost indistinguishable from the darkness itself, but Sarah knew it was watching her, waiting. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward, slow, deliberate, its form shifting like liquid, flowing toward her. The whispers grew louder, the words now clear, though they seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere. "You were never meant to leave." The figure reached out toward her with an outstretched hand, the fingers elongated and twisted, an unnatural, almost grotesque movement. Fear rooted her to the spot. But then, a scream. It wasn't her own voice. It was a voice from the past. A voice she knew. Her mother's. Sarah's heart stopped, her entire body freezing. Her mother had been in this house. Her mother had known this thing, had known what waited for her, and then the shadow was upon her. The shadow consumed the hallway. It wasn't just a figure, it was a force, an unnatural presence that expanded like a dark fog, swallowing everything in its path. Sarah's chest tightened as the air grew colder, each breath feeling like it could be her last. Her limbs were stiff, and though her body screamed at her to move, to flee, she couldn't bring herself to take a single step. The figure, whatever it was too close now, its long, twisted fingers outstretched like they were reaching for her very soul. Her heart hammered in her chest, every beat thundering in her ears. The whispering had stopped, but now, in the silence, a new sound filled the space. A low, rumbling hum that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into her bones. It was as if the very foundation of the cabin had come alive, as if it was speaking to her in a language that she couldn't understand, but that she somehow felt in the marrow of her being. The figure was right in front of her now. Its form was more than shadow. It was the absence of light, the space between reality and something far worse. Sarah felt herself drawn toward it, her feet unwillingly moving forward. She had no control anymore. It was as if her body was being pulled by the gravity of the thing standing before her. "You've crossed over," the voice spoke, but it wasn't the figure speaking. It was the voice of her mother, soft, familiar, but tinged with something ancient, something bitter. "You've crossed where you were never meant to, and now the price must be paid." The words sank into her, and for a moment she felt as though the room was spinning, or rather, as if the room were shifting. The walls seemed to bend, the floor undulating beneath her feet. For the briefest of moments, Sarah could see her mother, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth moving silently as though trying to scream, but no sound escaping. The shadow in front of her pulsed with an energy that seemed to draw the very life from her, feeding on her fear. Sarah tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but the words stuck in her throat. Her vision blurred, and in that disorienting moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of loss, like a part of her was already gone, ripped away before she could even understand it. "You've been chosen," the voice continued, now growing clearer. It no longer sounded like her mother, but something that had taken her voice, her form, and twisted it into something otherworldly. "You've felt the call of the bridge. You've heard its whispers. It knows you." Sarah's body shook, her limbs unsteady as she tried to step back, but the force that gripped her was too strong. The air around her grew thick with an icy chill that seeped into her skin, and for a moment she could have sworn she could hear the water flowing beneath the bridge again, distant and rushing, as though it were waiting for her. "You have been chosen," the voice repeated, and the room seemed to pulse in time with the words, "But now the bridge demands its due." In that moment, the floor beneath her feet gave way. She gasped, stumbling forward, feeling as though the earth itself had opened up to swallow her whole. Her fingers brushed against the walls, desperately searching for something to hold on to, but it was like trying to grip fog. The air around her twisted and warped, and the room seemed to stretch, elongating into darkness, until she couldn't tell which way was up or down. The world was unraveling, breaking apart, and Sarah was being pulled with it, and then nothing. A silence so deep, so profound, that it felt like the absence of everything, the stillness of a place beyond time. When Sarah's senses returned to her, she was no longer in the cabin. She was standing on the bridge, the one she had crossed in. The storm, the same swollen river, rushed beneath her, the water dark and violent, crashing against the wooden supports with a force that made her legs tremble. The sky overhead was thick with swirling clouds, the storm far from over, but something was different this time. The air was still. The wind didn't howl. It felt like the calm before an even greater storm. Her feet were rooted to the bridge, as if the wood itself had a hold on her. She tried to move, but the ground felt sticky, like tar, unwilling to release her. The man, the ranger, was standing there again. He wasn't moving, but she could feel his presence behind her, just at the edge of her awareness. His uniform was soaked through just as before, but now it seemed darker, more stained. His face was still hidden beneath the brim of his hat, and for a long moment he said nothing. It was as if he were waiting for her to understand something. Sarah's voice trembled as she finally spoke. "What is this? Where am I? What's happening?" The ranger took a slow step toward her, and his voice, though still low and monotone, carried a weight that seemed to sink into her chest. "You've crossed," he said. "You've come to the other side. This place, it belongs to the river. It belongs to what waits beyond." Sarah's heart pounded in her throat as she looked around. There was no sign of the familiar forest, no sign of her cabin. The bridge stretched endlessly, far beyond what she could see, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything in its wake. But there was a sense of familiarity too, as though she had always been here, as though this had been her destiny, waiting for her all along. "What do you mean, the other side?" she whispered, her throat dry, her mouth like cotton. "I didn't cross. I didn't want to come here." The ranger's voice remained cold, unfaltering. "The bridge calls, and those who hear its call must answer. The price must be paid." The shadows around her shifted, lengthening, twisting, as if the very darkness was alive. Sarah could feel something moving beneath her skin, in her blood, a coldness that spread out from her heart and curled its way through her veins. She wanted to scream, but the sound never came. The world tilted again, and she stumbled forward, her legs weak beneath her. The man stepped forward, his figure now more defined in the dim light, his presence solid and undeniable. The shadows wrapped around him like a cloak, growing darker with every movement. "The river," the ranger murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "It holds what is lost, and it waits for those who cross." As the words left his mouth, Sarah felt it, a sudden pressure, a tightening in her chest, as though something were pulling at her from all sides. The bridge beneath her shifted, the wood creaking ominously. She felt as though the ground were giving way, as though it wanted to drag her into the rushing waters below. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Suddenly she was falling into the blackness, into the river. But as she plunged into the icy waters, her last thought wasn't of fear. It was of understanding. The bridge, the river. It was never about the crossing. It was about what waited on the other side. It was about the price she had unknowingly paid, and then darkness. Sarah awoke with a violent jolt, her body jerking upright, as though the very force of her fall had ripped her from the depths of the darkness. But instead of the crushing cold of water, she found herself surrounded by a damp, suffocating silence, the air thick with the smell of decay, of something ancient and forgotten. Her skin prickled, her heart hammering against her ribcage, and yet there was no breath to be taken, no air to fill her lungs. She gasped, the sensation of drowning still lingering, as if the water had never truly left her. She was disoriented, disconnected, floating between worlds, caught in a space that wasn't meant for the living. The bridge had disappeared. The river had vanished, and all that remained was the soft, persistent hum of something unseen, a sound that vibrated through her body like a deep, resonating pulse. She glanced around, her eyes struggling to adjust to the overwhelming dark. It was as if she were in a place outside of time, outside of reality. The landscape before her was like no place she had ever seen, and yet it felt eerily familiar. The ground beneath her feet was wet, slick with moisture that glistened in the pale, non-existent light. The trees surrounding her were tall and twisted, their branches curling upward like gnarled hands reaching for the sky. There was no sky to be seen, only an infinite void, stretching endlessly above, devoid of stars, of moonlight, of anything that might give her direction. For a moment, Sarah stood still, her breathing shallow and frantic. She felt a weight in the air, something heavy, pressing against her from all sides, suffocating her thoughts. The faint buzzing, that hum, grew louder, filling her ears until it drowned out everything else. The trees seemed to whisper in the wind, though the words were lost on her. She could feel their presence, their silent judgment, as though they were aware of her, watching her every move. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice trembling, the words fragile and thin. But they felt insignificant here. They seemed to fall into the void with no echo, swallowed by the vast emptiness around her. There was no reply, only the hum and the whispering trees, and then, through the silence, she heard it, a low, deep growl rolling through the air like thunder. Her heart leapt into her throat, her body instinctively taking a step backward, her eyes scanning the darkness, searching for the source of the sound. The growl echoed again, louder this time, and then footsteps, slow, heavy, calculated. The darkness at the edge of her vision shifted, and there, stepping into the faint light, was the man, the ranger. But he was different now. His form was no longer just a shadow. It was solid, but somehow indistinct, his edges blurred, his body shifting, as though he were constantly in flux, part of the world, and yet not. His hat was still low, over his face, but Sarah could feel his eyes. She could feel him watching her, even though she couldn't see his expression. The air around him shimmered with a strange energy, like the very fabric of reality bent around his form. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice hoarse, fear creeping into her every word. She was shaking now, unable to stop it. The man didn't respond, but his presence seemed to draw closer until he was standing only a few feet away. "The bridge," he whispered, his voice carrying a weight of years, of things long buried. "You have crossed where you should not have, and now you are bound to what waits here." Sarah's breath caught. The words settled into her chest like lead, suffocating her. "Bound to what?" she asked, her voice trembling now. "What is this place?" The ranger tilted his head, his form wavering as though he were dissolving in the air. "The place beyond the bridge," he said, his voice growing fainter with each word. "The place where the lost are kept. The place where they belong." Her pulse raced. She understood then, the bridge. It wasn't just a crossing. It wasn't just a flood of water or a span of rotting wood. The bridge had been a gateway, a door to something far worse than she could ever have imagined. And now, she was here. She had crossed it. She had paid the price. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." The man didn't answer. He was silent now, his figure fading into the darkness. The hum grew louder again, and the ground beneath Sarah's feet seemed to tremble. She staggered, a dizzying wave of nausea overwhelming her as she tried to regain her balance. But it wasn't the ground that was shifting. It was her reality. The trees around her began to sway, their branches twisting as if the very earth beneath them was warping. The whispers grew louder, like voices in the wind, overlapping with one another. There were other voices now, strange, distorted, calling her name. Sarah. Her heart skipped a beat. She spun, her eyes frantically scanning the void, but there was no one there. "Sarah." The voice was clearer now, but it was wrong. It was her mother's voice, but it was hollow, distorted, as though it had been twisted by something ancient, something that had lived in the dark for far longer than Sarah could comprehend. "Come, find us!" The words echoed, twisting around her like a snare, pulling her in, dragging her deeper into the shadows. The air grew thick with moisture, the scent of wet earth and decay overwhelming her senses. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she saw them. Shadows in the darkness, shapes shifting in the periphery of her sight. Faces, eyes, people, her mother, her father, and then someone else. A figure standing in the dark, cloaked in shadow. Its shape was familiar, but wrong, twisted in a way that made her blood run cold. It moved, just a step, but it felt like 100 steps. And then, another growl. Closer. The ground beneath her feet trembled again, and Sarah staggered backward, trying to push herself away, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows were closing in, the whispers louder now, overlapping, drowning her in their cold, hungry voices. "You can't escape," the voice of the ranger rasped, though his form was gone. "You're already here. You've already crossed." "No!" Sarah screamed, her voice piercing the silence, but the words didn't break the spell. They only made it stronger. The darkness rushed toward her, pressing in on her from every direction. The figure stepped forward again, its eyes glowing in the darkness, its mouth stretching into a grotesque smile. It reached out, its fingers long and twisted, and for the first time Sarah saw its face, if it could even be called a face. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything she could understand. Its mouth opened, revealing jagged teeth, and it whispered, "Welcome to the other side." And then the world broke. The world turned to nothing, and then silence. Silence. The void stretched endlessly, suffocating and cold. Sarah's mind felt like it was suspended in the emptiness, floating in a place where time no longer held meaning. There was no sound, no movement, only the sensation of her own breath, the faintest whisper of her heartbeat, each thud echoing in the void. The darkness was all-encompassing, swallowing everything, consuming the very fabric of her thoughts. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. The weight of the silence pressed down on her, a heavy hand on her chest, choking her. Her body felt as though it were dissolving into the air, no longer solid, no longer hers. Every ounce of fear she had ever felt, every moment of doubt, every regret, everything she had ever feared, seemed to be folded into the nothingness around her. Where am I? The question echoed through her mind, but the answer never came. There was no reply, no response from the emptiness. It was as though she were the last living thing in a world that had long since fallen into decay. But then, movement. Just a flicker at first. A small disturbance in the air, like a ripple in water. Then, more. Shapes, dark and shifting, took form in the distance. At first they were nothing but shadows, but they began to grow clearer, more defined, as though the darkness itself were giving way, revealing pieces of the world that had been hidden. Sarah's heart jolted in her chest as she recognized them, figures standing in the darkness. Their eyes glowed, faint but unmistakable. Faces twisted and distorted in ways that shouldn't be possible. They were the lost, the ones who had crossed before her, those who had gone before the bridge, long forgotten, yet still bound to it. Their forms were not human, not anymore. They watched her, silent, unmoving, their hollow eyes fixed on her, as though waiting for something she didn't understand. But even in their silence, there was an oppressive weight to their gaze, a hunger, a longing, a need. One of them stepped forward, its form twisting like smoke, bending the very light around it. It was the figure from before, the one with the grotesque face, the twisted smile. But now, as it moved closer, it seemed even more monstrous, its features more contorted, like something that had been pulled from the deepest, most unimaginable corners of the earth. It reached out to her, its hand impossibly long, its fingers curling like the branches of a dead tree. Sarah froze, her body no longer her own, as though she had been bound by invisible chains. Her body was trapped in a state of terror so intense, so consuming, that it rendered her completely still, unable to flee, unable to fight. The figure leaned in close, its breath foul and cold, like rot and mildew. It whispered, its voice a rasping echo in the air. "You are ours now, Sarah." The words dripped with malice, and with them, an overwhelming wave of dread washed over her, crushing her like an unrelenting tide. She could feel it then, the pull of the void, the tug of the bridge that had crossed into this place, the feeling of being drawn deeper, of being claimed by something she couldn't comprehend. The darkness, the cold, it had always been here, waiting. The bridge, the warnings, the rangers, it was all part of the same thing. She struggled, her mind clawing at the edges of the reality she had known. But the darkness around her was like a living, breathing thing, seeping into her thoughts, wrapping itself around her like tendrils of shadow. It fed on her fear, her confusion, and with each passing second she felt herself losing her grip on herself, on everything that had been hers. But then, a spark. It was small, barely a flicker, but it was there. It came from deep within her, a flicker of defiance that was stronger than the shadows, stronger than the fear that gripped her. It was the memory of her mother, the way she had always been there for her. The stories she had told her about the woods, about the things that lived in them. The warmth of those memories, the love, the knowledge suddenly filled her chest like fire. "You will not take me," Sarah whispered, though the words felt fragile, like a dying ember in the face of the storm. But it was enough. The words were enough to make the figure pause. The darkness shuddered. For a moment, the world around her seemed to fracture, breaking apart like glass. The figure hesitated, its grotesque smile faltering. "You think you can escape?" it hissed, its voice shrill as if angry. "You are already part of the bridge. You are already part of the price." Sarah's pulse quickened. She could feel the darkness closing in, but something inside her, a tiny spark of resistance, refused to be extinguished. The figure's grip, its pull on her, seemed to weaken for just a moment. That moment was all she needed. She took a deep breath, pulling the last of her strength together, and in an instant she lunged forward. The shadow reeled back, its form warping, flickering in and out of existence. The air vibrated with tension, like the world itself was about to tear apart. For the briefest of moments, Sarah felt herself slip from the grip of the dark. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know what she was running toward, but she knew she couldn't stay here. She couldn't allow herself to be consumed by this place. And then the world shifted again. Everything spun around her. The shadows that had closed in seemed to retreat, pulling away from her in an overwhelming wave. The darkness began to break apart like smoke in the wind. The voices, the whispers, they faded, slipping into nothing. And with that, Sarah felt the ground solidify beneath her once more. She was back on the bridge, the familiar wooden planks beneath her feet. The river, swollen with the storm, rushing beneath. The storm was gone, but the air still carried the heaviness of what had passed. Her hands were shaking, her body exhausted, but she was alive. She was back. But as she looked around, she saw something else. The man, the ranger, was standing there, watching her, his presence like a shadow in the corner of her vision. His figure was no longer a form of mere darkness, but something more solid, more defined. His hat still obscured his face, but there was no mistaking the quiet sense of power that emanated from him. And then he spoke. "It is done. You have crossed, and you have returned." Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She was exhausted, drained, her mind struggling to comprehend everything that had happened. The ranger took a slow step toward her, and for the first time, Sarah saw the truth of his face beneath the brim of his hat. His eyes were empty, and then he was gone. The air around her was still, silent. But Sarah felt something else, something more than the storm, more than the fear. She felt free. She didn't know how, she didn't know why, but she knew she had reclaimed herself, and the bridge, the dark place beyond it, would never call her again. The silence lingered after the ranger's disappearance, stretching thin and unbearable, wrapping itself around Sarah like the heavy, damp fog that settled over the forest. She stood alone on the bridge, staring into the rushing water below, the once violent current now eerily calm, as if it too had been changed by the encounter. The oppressive weight of the air had lifted, but in its place a heavy stillness remained. The woods on either side seemed untouched, silent, as though they were holding their breath, waiting for something that hadn't yet come. Sarah's legs felt weak beneath her, her body exhausted from the ordeal. Her skin was still cold, still damp from the storm that had passed, and yet the feeling of wrongness, the sensation that something had been altered irrevocably, remained in the pit of her stomach. She wanted to believe it was over, that the bridge had given up its hold on her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching, still waiting. For a moment she stood there, staring at the river. Its water, which had once been a churning mass, was now eerily placid, reflecting the dark sky above like a mirror, unnaturally still. It was as if the force of nature had somehow been subdued, tamed by something beyond her understanding. She felt the pull to look closer, to peer into the water, but something in her resisted. "I'm free," she whispered to herself, trying to steady her breath. But even as the words left her mouth, they felt hollow. Her voice seemed too loud in the silence, a sharp contrast to the eerie quiet around her. But the truth of her words, that she was free, was harder to accept than she had imagined. She had crossed the bridge, faced the darkness on the other side, and come back. But at what cost? What part of her had stayed there, in that shadowed place, in the grip of whatever had waited for her? What had she lost in exchange for this fragile peace? Her gaze flickered to the forest behind her. The path she had traveled before the storm, the same roads she had driven so many times, felt impossibly distant now. The familiar surroundings, the very earth beneath her feet, felt like foreign terrain, a place she no longer belonged. She felt disconnected from everything she had once known: her cabin, her memories, even her own reflection in the still water. A part of her longed to return to the safety of her cabin, to the warmth and comfort of her home. But another part of her knew that whatever had happened here, on the bridge, had altered her forever. She could feel it in her bones, in the way the world seemed to hum with the faintest energy, a hum that had been absent before. As she turned away from the river, she felt the familiar pull of the forest, the sensation of eyes watching her from the shadows. It was not the man this time. It was something else, something older. A voice, a whisper brushed against her mind. It wasn't words exactly, but an idea, a fleeting thought that seemed to pierce her consciousness. The price is never paid. It is only postponed. Her breath caught in her throat as she spun around, her heart hammering again. The bridge, the dark, twisted form of the man with... The empty eyes had vanished, but the words lingered, vibrating through her skull. The price is never paid. She knew then that the bridge had never truly let her go. Not really. It was not something you could escape. It was not something you could outrun. It was a part of her now. The forest shifted, the trees bending in unnatural ways as shadows moved just beyond her vision, darting in and out of the periphery like lurking predators. The whispering had returned, growing louder, more insistent. Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise as the feeling of being watched intensified. She tried to ignore it, to convince herself that it was just the remnants of her fear, but the sensation was too strong. The weight of something dark, something ancient, was pressing down on her, suffocating her once again. She took a step forward, hesitant, unsure of what to do, but then she heard it. The faintest sound, just above the hum of the wind. A creak. The unmistakable sound of wood groaning under weight. The bridge. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, her feet moving before her mind could even process the thought. She turned back to the bridge, her eyes widening as she saw something. It was subtle at first. A figure standing in the center, too far away to be sure, but the movement caught her eye. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as the figure grew clearer, more defined. The man was back. But this time, there was no mistaking the darkness that surrounded him. He wasn't just a man anymore, not in the way he had appeared before. His form was shifting, growing, expanding like the shadows themselves were taking shape. His uniform, once soaked and ragged, was now tattered and blackened, as if it had been burned by some unseen fire. His body was no longer solid. It flickered like a candle burning out, the edges of his form dissolving and reforming with each step. The empty eyes, now visible beneath the brim of his hat, burned with a faint, unnatural glow. He was no longer simply a man in a uniform. He was something else, something older, something that had been waiting for her to return. She felt it then, the call. The bridge had never let go. It had never intended to. "Sarah," the figure rasped, his voice no longer the hollow monotone it had once been. It was deeper now, reverberating like a distant thunderstorm. "You think you have escaped, but the bridge is never truly crossed. It follows you. It is a part of you." Her chest tightened, and the ground beneath her feet began to shift again. The trees around her groaned, the shadows lengthening and curling like serpents, as if they were alive, as if the forest itself were bending toward her. "No," she whispered, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. "I won't go back. I won't." But it was already too late. The shadows stretched toward her, and she felt herself being pulled in, her body drawn toward the figure. She could feel the bridge, feel it in her bones like an ache that wouldn't go away. And then, in the stillness, she realized something. Something that made the very air in her lungs feel heavy. It wasn't that the bridge called to her. It wasn't that it had claimed her. She had invited it, and now there was no escaping it. The forest around Sarah seemed to breathe. It wasn't just the wind stirring the trees or the shifting shadows. It was something far older, far more ancient. The very ground beneath her feet thrummed with an energy that was primal and alive, as though the earth itself was aware of her presence, as though the woods and the bridge shared a silent, secret understanding. The figure, the ranger, was no longer a man, not entirely. He had become something else, something formless and shifting, a creature of the dark that could barely contain its own hunger. His uniform, once the worn garb of a park ranger, had become something twisted, ragged, and burned. The edges of his form were indistinct, flickering like the light of a dying fire. But his eyes burned through the shadows, glowing faintly, a haunting light that cut through the dark like twin embers. "You think you are free," the voice rasped again. But it was no longer just one voice. It was many voices now, layered on top of one another, each whispering, humming, like the chorus of the lost. But the price is always paid. It's only ever delayed. Sarah felt a cold sweat break out across her brow as the world seemed to tilt around her. She wanted to turn, to run, but her feet were stuck, rooted to the ground. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, each breath a struggle as if the very atmosphere had become too heavy to bear. "You've crossed it," the ranger continued, stepping closer, his form shifting with each movement. "And now you carry it with you. The bridge isn't just a place, it's a curse, a burden." The ground beneath Sarah's feet trembled, a deep rumble that spread through the earth like the very pulse of the forest itself. She could feel it now, the draw of the bridge, the pull of the river that had claimed so many before her. It wasn't just the land that was alive, it was the river too, and it wasn't done with her yet. The air around her thickened with a damp, cold mist swirling like smoke, distorting the view of the world around her. The bridge, though distant, loomed in the background, and Sarah could feel the familiar weight of the river pressing against her chest again, filling her lungs with the taste of decay. The world beyond the bridge had not disappeared. It had just folded into the layers of reality, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to surface again. The trees whispered in the wind, their voices indistinct but full of sorrow, full of warning. And then the ranger stepped forward, his figure growing larger, his shadow stretching impossibly long. The distance between them seemed to vanish as he moved closer, and Sarah felt herself falling backward, as though she were drifting toward the river once more. The forest around her became a maze, the path to freedom obscured, and she was lost within it. "No," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't want this. I don't want any of this." The ranger did not respond with words, but with an overwhelming presence. His form flickered violently, and for a moment it was as though he were no longer human at all. His eyes, those hollow, glowing pits, pierced her, and the air became still. The trees stilled, the river stilled. It was as if time itself had stopped. And then the shadows moved. They weren't the shadows of trees or branches anymore. They were alive. The darkness around Sarah seemed to shift, to slither and undulate, like a sea of ink pooling toward her. It moved in tendrils, coiling around her legs, her waist, her arms. It pulled at her, dragging her toward the center of the bridge, to the very point where it all began. The edges of her vision blurred, and for the briefest moment she saw the river's current surge back to life, the waves crashing in reverse, as if time itself was being undone. "No!" she screamed, her voice hoarse. But it was drowned out by the rumbling that seemed to vibrate from deep within the earth, like the sound of ancient roots being torn from the soil. The shadows closed in tighter, their grip around her becoming suffocating, each tendril a reminder of how far she had fallen from grace. She tried to pull away, but the shadows clung to her like a second skin. The darkness was cold, relentless, and it seemed to seep into her very soul. She felt it, the pull of the bridge, the way it knew her, how it had always known her. The river had not only claimed her body, it had claimed her essence, her spirit, and now the forest, the bridge, the dark entities that dwelled in the spaces between. They were coming for everything that was hers. In that moment, Sarah realized the truth. It wasn't about escaping. It wasn't about running. The bridge wasn't just a place. It was a tether, a connection to something older, something ancient, something that had always been there, lurking in the shadows of the world. And once she had crossed it, once she had answered its call, she had become part of it. The figure of the ranger stepped closer, his voice barely a whisper now. "You are one of us now. You always were." Sarah's heart thudded in her chest, her breath shallow as she realized what he meant. The bridge didn't just claim the living. It claimed the souls of those who had crossed it, forever binding them to its dark embrace. Those who crossed did not leave. They became part of the land, part of the river. And as much as she had thought she had returned, as much as she had believed herself to be free, she was wrong. There was no escape. The shadows grew thick, suffocating her, consuming her thoughts, until there was nothing left but the hum of the darkness. Her body trembled under their weight, and the last vestiges of the world she had once known faded away, swallowed by the shadows. And then, as if the darkness had made its final claim, everything fell silent. When Sarah opened her eyes again, she wasn't alone. She never had been. She was part of it now. The bridge had taken its due, and she was bound to it. An echo of the lost, a whisper in the wind. The last remnants of her life, the woman she had been, were fading. But she could still hear them, the voices of those who had crossed before. Her, their whispers in the trees, their hollow eyes watching her from the shadows. She was no longer Sarah. She was just another piece of the bridge, and the bridge was never finished, not until it had claimed everyone. Sarah's world was no longer the one she had known. The trees, once familiar, now seemed alien, twisted and bent in ways that defied nature. The forest, the bridge, the river, they all existed in a place beyond understanding, a realm where time was a fluid, changing thing, and where shadows clung to the air itself. The wind no longer whispered through the leaves. Instead, it was a low, mournful moan, like the collective sighs of lost souls who had once passed through here. She could feel them, the others, the ones who had crossed before her, who were now bound to this place just as she was. Their presence was a constant hum in the back of her mind, a low, insistent buzzing that never stopped. At first she had thought it was her own heartbeat, her own thoughts, her own pulse. But no, this was something else, something older, something that had always been here, waiting for her. Now she was part of it. She stood there at the center of the bridge, her legs shaky and unsteady beneath her, as the shadow of the ranger, no longer fully a man, loomed over her. He had not spoken since his last words. He had not needed to. The pull of the bridge, the river, the forest, they had done all the speaking for him. "You belong here," his voice rasped again, echoing in her mind like 1,000 whispers. "You have always belonged here." Sarah didn't reply. She couldn't. The words felt too heavy on her tongue, as if they were no longer hers to say. She could feel it now. The tether, the connection between her and this place, the bridge, the forest, the dark river that wound beneath it all. It was as though the very essence of her had been intertwined with the land, with the curse that had claimed her, and those before her. There was no escape. There never had been. At first, the sensation had been terrifying, overwhelming. The thought of being trapped here, bound to the forest, to the river, to the bridge that had once been a simple crossing, seemed too much to bear. But now, something had shifted. A quiet acceptance had settled over her, like the shadows wrapping themselves around her heart. She had crossed. She had paid the price. She was here now, and she would remain here. The ranger stepped forward, his form flickering like a mirage, the flicker of a man who was no longer quite human. His eyes, those glowing, empty eyes, looked through her, beyond her, as though he could see something in the distance that she could not. Perhaps he was looking at the others, the lost souls who wandered this forsaken place, their faces a blur of shadows and memories. "You will guide them now," he said softly, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "They are the ones who will cross. They will feel the pull just as you did. They will follow the call." Sarah blinked, the weight of his words pressing on her chest. Guide them. She didn't understand. She couldn't. No part of her could fathom what he meant. She didn't want to guide anyone into this nightmare. She had barely escaped it herself, and yet, there it was again. The pull. A new presence. At first it was faint, a flicker in the corner of her mind, like the distant sound of something moving through the trees. But then, it became clearer. She could feel it. Another soul. Another traveler. Another lost. One who had followed the same path she once had. Their presence felt familiar, yet strange, like a shadow cast by her own heart. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth and damp leaves. And there, standing at the edge of the bridge, was a figure, a woman drenched and trembling, just as Sarah had been when she first encountered the ranger. The woman's face was obscured by the rain, but Sarah could feel the weight of her fear, the confusion, the longing to understand. The figure took a tentative step forward, as if drawn by something invisible, by the same force that had once pulled Sarah. And just like that, the moment the woman stepped onto the bridge, Sarah knew. The cycle had begun again. She was no longer just a victim of the bridge. She was part of it. She was the one who would call to the lost, the ones who wandered the edges of this cursed realm. She would be the one to guide them across, to ensure they crossed into the same shadowed abyss that she had once fallen into. The bridge didn't need to pull them anymore. It had her. It had her voice. "You are not alone," Sarah whispered, the words slipping out of her mouth before she could stop them, her voice hollow and empty, just as it had been when the ranger first spoke to her. "You have crossed into this place, and now you belong to it." The woman looked up at her, her face pale beneath the water-drenched strands of her hair. Fear, desperation, and the fading light of hope flickered in her eyes, but it was already too late. She had crossed. She had stepped onto the bridge, and she would never leave. "I am sorry," Sarah murmured, the words strangling her as she looked at the woman. But the truth of it settled over her like an anchor. It had been her fate to cross. It had been her fate to be claimed by the bridge, to guide the lost. And now, it was the woman's fate too. She would walk the same path Sarah had walked, through the forest, across the bridge, and into the river, where the shadows waited. Where the past and the future collided in an endless loop. The ranger was watching now, his form flickering more rapidly, the darkness surrounding him thickening. It was as if the air itself was bending around him, warping, distorting everything that wasn't tied to the bridge. The land itself seemed to breathe, like a living, conscious thing. The cycle would never end. It was always the same. The bridge would always call. The lost would always follow. And Sarah, now forever bound to this place, would be the one to guide them. The price is never paid. It is only delayed. The woman on the bridge took another step, and Sarah could hear the whispers rise around them, an endless chorus of voices, the lost, the forgotten, the ones who had crossed before. And Sarah, she was now one of them. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and for a brief moment, she thought she might be able to tear herself away from the darkness. But the moment passed like a whisper lost in the wind. The shadowed forest around her seemed to breathe, its roots stretching deep into the earth, entwining with her very soul, pulling her back into the deep void she had once thought she'd escaped. She wasn't free. She wasn't alone. The woman on the bridge, the one who had just stepped into the cursed threshold, was not her reflection, but there was something familiar about her. The same fear, the same lost look in her eyes, the same way her legs wavered under the weight of the unseen force pulling her forward. The cycle was endless. The woman looked up at Sarah, her eyes wide, her voice barely a whisper. "What is this place? Where am I?" Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her throat was dry, the air thick and suffocating around her. The voices of the lost, the ones who had crossed before her, filled the silence with their cries, their pleas for release, their hollow echoes reverberating through the air like the sound of wind in a forgotten tomb. There was no answer. There was no explanation. Sarah had no more words to give, but the pull was still there, stronger than ever. It surged through her chest, through her heart, until she could feel her very essence being drawn back to the same place she had once fallen into. The bridge, the dark river, the waiting shadows. The woman took another step, closer to Sarah, and the weight of her presence, the weight of the journey that had led her here, pushed against Sarah's chest like a suffocating wave. She was the next one, the next lost soul to cross, and Sarah knew what would happen next. She would call to her, guide her across the bridge. They would both be bound. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice cracked and broken, though she wasn't sure if it was for herself or for the woman standing before her. "You don't understand. You can't cross. Not like this." The woman took another step forward, her eyes wide with confusion. "I don't understand what?" Her voice shook, a tremor of panic in it, as if she knew something was wrong, but couldn't fully grasp it. "Please tell me, what is this place? Why am I here?" The wind howled through the trees, and the shadows that had been waiting patiently seemed to stir, restless, as though the forest itself was responding to the woman's words. The ranger, if he could still be called that, stepped forward, his form flickering and shifting like smoke, becoming more and more indistinct with every movement. The shadows thickened around him like a cloak, until it felt as though the very fabric of the world was folding in on itself. Sarah felt the familiar tug, The tether, the pull from deep within her, from the river that had claimed her. It was waiting for the woman to step into the current, for her to feel the call of the dark waters and be consumed by them, just as Sarah had once been. She took another step, the shadows following her every movement like a dark cloud. "Please," the woman begged again, her voice breaking. "Help me, I just need to go home. I don't know what's happening. I don't even know how I got here." Sarah's heart twisted in her chest as she looked at the woman. She knew the fear, the hopelessness that clung to her. She had felt it herself back when she had crossed. But the difference now, the terrible truth, was that Sarah could no longer offer a way out. There was no way back. The bridge, the river, they were the way. Once you stepped into their grip, you didn't leave. You became part of it. You can't leave, Sarah said, her voice trembling. The weight of those words felt like a weight in her chest, pressing down harder with every breath. "None of us can. Not anymore." The woman's breath caught in her throat, and she looked down at her feet, as though she could somehow outrun the pull, as if she could escape the very ground beneath her. But the forest, the bridge, it was alive with darkness, with waiting. "I don't understand," the woman whispered, her voice faltering. "Why can't we leave? Why do we keep coming back here?" Sarah closed her eyes. The truth was a heavy burden, too much for her to carry alone. "Because the bridge calls us," she said softly, her voice like a murmur in the wind. "It always calls." There was a long silence. The woman looked at Sarah, as if trying to understand, to find something that would make it all make sense. Her eyes searched Sarah's face, and in that moment Sarah saw the same desperation, the same silent plea that had been in her own eyes when she had first crossed. "You don't have to stay," the woman whispered, her voice faint, as though she still held onto a shred of hope. "There has to be a way out of here. There has to be something we can do." But Sarah shook her head, the weight of reality settling deeper into her bones. "You can't escape. None of us can. We are here now. We are part of it." The trees around them rustled again, their whispers growing louder, more insistent, as though the forest itself was speaking to them. The shadows, thick and hungry, began to stretch toward the woman, their forms swirling, moving like an endless tide. It was time. The bridge was waiting. The pull of the river was growing stronger. The woman stepped back, shaking her head. "No!" "I refuse to believe that. I won't give in." Sarah could feel the tremor of fear, of resistance in her, but it wouldn't matter. It never did. The river was too strong. The shadows too relentless. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek as she turned toward the woman. She wasn't sorry for the woman herself. There was no pity, no mercy here. She was sorry that it had come to this. That she had come to this. The moment the woman's foot touched the first wooden plank of the bridge, the world around them shifted. The darkness swallowed the space between them. The forest trembled, and the river roared to life beneath them. The pull of the shadows, the tether, grew so strong, so overwhelming, that Sarah felt as if she were being torn apart from the inside out. And then, as the woman took another step onto the bridge, Sarah felt it. She was not just a guide. She was part of the bridge now, part of the river, part of the endless cycle. The darkness closed in around them both. The woman's foot touched the bridge, and the moment it did, the world around Sarah fractured like brittle glass. It wasn't the sharp, painful kind of break, but a slow, twisting disintegration that spread through the air, through her very soul. She could feel the bridge shift, feel it call louder now. The pulse, that dark, insistent thrum deep in her chest, grew in strength. It was no longer just a feeling of weight or dread. It was a living thing, hungry and alive, pulling at her bones, wrapping around her heart, tugging her back to the very place she had thought she'd escaped. The shadows responded, their presence growing heavier, thicker, filling the space around them both. They moved like ink in water, slow, almost imperceptible at first, but then overwhelming in their speed, reaching for the woman, encircling her. The figures that had once been lost, who wandered this place like echoes of forgotten lives, were rising again. They stepped from the trees, from the shadows, from the very fabric of the air itself. Faces, distant and blurred, flickered in the dark, their eyes empty and hungry, their mouths slack with a hunger that had never been sated. They were the others, the lost, the bound, and now they were part of the pull. The woman gasped, her breath catching in her throat, and she stumbled forward onto the bridge. The first step had been tentative, filled with fear. But now, as the shadows swirled around her, her footfall seemed almost inevitable, as if the bridge had claimed her already, as if there was no turning back. She froze in place, her eyes wide, her breath shallow, and Sarah felt her heart tighten in her chest. "I can't move," the woman whispered, her voice trembling as she looked around, her gaze darting to Sarah. The terror was plain in her eyes. The same terror Sarah had felt, the same confusion, the same crushing weight of realization that came too late. "You can't," Sarah said, her voice soft but resigned. She could hear the crackling in her own voice, as if the very words were being torn from her, the weight of centuries of darkness pressing down. "None of us can." The woman shook her head, her eyes filling with desperation. "Please, I don't understand. I don't want this. This can't be real." But it was real. It had always been real. The bridge, the river, the forest, the darkness, they were more real than anything she had ever known. And Sarah could no longer pretend it wasn't a part of her. She was no longer just an observer in this place. She was a guide. She was a tether, an anchor between the living and the lost. The cycle was beginning again, and there was nothing Sarah could do to stop it. "You're not alone," Sarah whispered, though the words barely felt like her own. She felt the shadows tightening around the woman, reaching for her, wrapping around her like cold fingers, pulling her deeper into the place Sarah had once fallen into. "We're all here now. We're all part of this." The woman's body jerked as if she were pulled by invisible strings, but her eyes never left Sarah. I don't understand. Why me? Why now?" Sarah couldn't answer. She couldn't find the words. The truth, the terrible, suffocating truth, was too much. There was no reason. There was no fate, no cosmic balance. The bridge called, and those who crossed answered. Whether they wanted to or not, they crossed. The cycle was eternal, unbroken. And those who answered the call were bound to it forever. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I thought I could too." The woman's eyes widened, panic flickering across her features as she tried to pull herself back, to step off the bridge, but the shadows, the pull, had already wrapped themselves around her. The darkness had already begun to consume her. Sarah saw her begin to tremble, her legs shaking beneath her as if she were losing control of her own body, as if she were becoming nothing but a part of the land. The woman cried out in fear, her voice rising, but the sound was soon drowned out by the rush of the river below, the same river that had claimed Sarah, the same river that had claimed all those before her. And then, with one last desperate scream, the woman was pulled into the shadow, the darkness engulfing her whole, swallowing her entirely. There was a terrible moment of stillness, a final echo of her cry that seemed to hang in the air like a dying breath. And then, nothing. Sarah didn't move. She couldn't. She didn't have the strength to move. She could feel it now, the bridge, the very essence of it curling around her, sinking into her soul, like a vine wrapping around a tree. She felt the presence of the others, their eyes upon her, their hollow gazes following her every movement. They were part of her now, part of the bridge, part of the cycle. Sarah knew what she had to do. She had always known. Her soul, her essence was bound to this place now, and as much as she wanted to fight it, she couldn't. There was no escaping the pull, there was no escaping the tether. She had to guide the lost. She had to bring them across. She was not just a prisoner of this place. She was part of the bridge, a conduit between the living and the lost. A figure emerged from the dark, stepping slowly onto the bridge. Another lost soul, another soul drawn by the call of the river. Sarah's heart clenched in her chest. It was her mother. The vision flickered, warped by the shadows, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her mother's face was there, but it wasn't her mother. Not anymore. Her features were twisted, aged beyond recognition, as though time had eroded her very essence. Her eyes were empty, like the eyes of the others, the ones who had been lost before, the ones who had crossed and never returned. "You see," the voice of the ranger rasped from the shadows, his form flickering in and out of sight. "The bridge takes what it is owed. The cycle never ends. It calls, and those who hear it must answer." Sarah could feel the tears welling up in her eyes. She had crossed. She had been lost. She had been swallowed whole by the river, and now she was one of them. Her mother's hollow eyes locked onto hers. The pull was undeniable. The cycle was starting again. Sarah could feel the bridge's insatiable hunger, the pull of the river, the call of the shadows. She stepped forward, her legs moving on their own, her heart a cold, dead thing. And as the woman's voice faded into the dark, as Sarah took her place at the edge of the bridge, she realized that there would always be someone else. Another soul. Another lost one to guide. Another life to be consumed. The bridge would never stop calling. Sarah stood at the edge of the bridge, the river below now nothing more than a churning black void. Her mind was heavy, weighed down by centuries of silence and sorrow, the full knowledge of what she had become now a constant companion. The call of the bridge, the tether, was not something she could ignore, not something she could fight. It was a part of her now, and she knew that it always would be. The air was thick with the weight of those who had come before her. Their shadows lingered, trapped between the world of the living and the world of the lost, their memories echoing through the woods, through the bridge, through her very soul. She could feel them in the silence. She could feel their presence, their hunger, the way they were waiting. They were waiting, just like she had once been, trapped by the same insidious call that had pulled her across and bound her to the bridge. It was an endless loop, an eternal cycle, and now she was part of it. The shadows gathered around her, the voices of the lost growing louder with each passing moment. Their whispers filled the air, swirling around her like a whirlwind. The forest, the river, the bridge, they were all alive, alive in a way that defied explanation. They breathed in unison, pulsed with an ancient rhythm, as though the land itself was conscious of its hunger, conscious of its unyielding need for those who crossed. She felt the shift before she saw it. The presence. Another lost soul. Another traveler stepping from the darkness beyond the bridge. At first, they were just a flicker, a shape in the distance, but then they became more defined. A man, tall, disheveled, his clothes soaked through, his face hidden beneath the brim of a hat. He stepped forward slowly, his movements hesitant, his steps drawn toward the center of the bridge, as if he had no choice but to follow the path that had been set before him. Sarah's heart skipped, a jolt of recognition. This was it. This was the moment she had known would come, the moment she had dreaded. She wasn't just the one who would guide the lost anymore. She was The lost. She was part of the bridge, and so were they. This man would be drawn to the same fate she had once faced. The pull was inevitable. The man looked up then, his gaze locking onto hers. His eyes, wide with fear, flickered with that same uncomprehending terror she had seen in so many before him. She could see the fear in his eyes, but also the weariness. He knew something was wrong. He knew he didn't belong here, but it was too late. "You're here," she whispered, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. Her voice was hollow now, empty of emotion. There was nothing left of the person she once was, no sense of freedom, no sense of choice. The bridge had taken her, and it would take him too. "I don't know how I got here," the man stammered, his voice cracking with panic. "Where am I? What is this place? Please help me. I don't know where I am." Sarah closed her eyes, her breath shallow. The pull, the tether, was overwhelming. It reached into her chest, gripped her heart, making her feel like she was drowning in it. This was the moment, the final part of the cycle. She was not the savior. She was not the guide. She was just another piece of the bridge, another forgotten soul lost in the abyss. "You don't have to understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible, drowned by the noise of the shadows. "You only have to accept." The man shook his head violently, his hands shaking. "No, I won't accept this. I won't." The air seemed to shift with his words, the tension growing unbearable. And for a moment, Sarah almost thought she could hear the wind howling, the river surging beneath them. But it wasn't the wind. It wasn't the river. It was the bridge. The earth beneath them quaked, the sound of wood groaning in protest. The very ground shook, as if the bridge itself were coming to life, bending and twisting under the weight of the souls it held. The shadows twisted around them, coiling tighter, like serpents ready to strike. The man stumbled back, his feet slipping on the wet wood of the bridge. His breath came in short, frantic bursts, and Sarah saw the terror in his eyes. She felt it, too. She felt the overwhelming weight of everything, the loss, the sorrow, the hunger that lived in the very air. She wanted to run, to break free, but there was no running here. There was no escape. The shadows closed in around them both. The man's body jerked forward, as though pulled by unseen hands. He gasped, his hands reaching out as if trying to cling to something, to anything, but there was nothing left to hold on to. "Don't," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please." And then, just as the shadows enveloped him completely, Sarah heard it. The crack, the sound of something ancient, something terrible, breaking apart, snapping under the weight of time and forgotten memories. The bridge groaned, its timbers splintering as though they could no longer hold the weight of all the souls it had claimed. Sarah felt it. She felt it too. The pain, the suffocating pull. She felt herself slip further into the shadows, deeper, into the place she had always known but never fully understood. The bridge, the land, it was all connected. And now, it was consuming her, consuming him and the others, over and over again. The man's final scream was swallowed by the darkness, his body absorbed into the shadows, his form becoming one, with the bridge, with the river, with the forever that awaited those who crossed. And as Sarah stood there, her own form flickering like a shadow, she realized with quiet, hollow clarity, there was no end. There would never be an end. The bridge would always call, the river would always claim, the lost would always follow, the cycle would repeat. And Sarah was a part of it now. She would guide the lost, just as the shadows had guided her. She would wait for the next soul to step onto the bridge, to step into the void. The river would always have them. She closed her eyes, feeling the pull of the endless darkness, and let it consume her once more. And so, the cycle continued. This is the end of Sarah's story. But it is only the beginning of the bridge. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The forest was quiet when Mark and Luke began their trek. The faint murmur of the wind through the towering pines the only sound. Their boots crunched against the moss-covered trail, the damp earth beneath their feet soft from the overnight rain. The air was heavy with the scent of wet wood and the cool bite of early autumn. In Oregon's Tillamook forest, there was always something otherworldly about the landscape. The way the trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their gnarled limbs twisted into strange shapes, shadows clinging to every branch. They had planned the trip for months, a week-long backpacking adventure to clear their heads and reconnect. Luke, a quiet and introspective man, had been grieving his mother's death for nearly a year, but the trip was supposed to help him find peace. Mark, always the optimistic one, had insisted that the isolation of the forest, the simplicity of hiking, would be just what they needed to clear away the fog of grief. At first, everything seemed perfect. The forest was vast, stretching endlessly in all directions, and they had the trails mostly to themselves. The sun broke through the trees in scattered patches, casting long, dappled shadows on the path ahead. The first few hours passed uneventfully. Mark chatted excitedly about everything and nothing, while Luke kept to himself, lost in thought. But then the weather started to change. A sudden shift in the air was the first sign, a chill that didn't belong in the midday warmth. Mark glanced up at the sky, his brow furrowing. What had been a clear blue sky now seemed to be growing heavy with clouds, darkening by the minute. The wind picked up, twisting through the trees in a restless howl, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Mark cursed under his breath. The forecast didn't mention anything about rain today. Luke, who had been scanning the trail ahead, offered a faint, non-committal grunt in response. He was used to Mark's weather-related complaints. But as they pulled their hoods up and fastened their jackets against the cold, the rain began to fall harder, soaking them through in a matter of minutes. It wasn't the kind of storm that comes in and goes out with the wind. It was persistent, a slow, unyielding fall of water that clung to their skin, like the forest itself was trying to pull them into its depths. They pressed on. As they continued their hike, the rain did not let up. It wasn't violent, but its consistency wore at their spirits. It became a companion, relentless and constant, as though the sky had decided that they, and only they, would feel the full weight of it. The path, once dry and easily passable, now seemed to transform beneath their boots, slippery and uneven. The forest was suffocating, the trees around them loomed larger, more oppressive, and the air seemed to grow thicker by the hour. By the time they reached the first clearing, they were both soaked to the bone. Mark pulled out the map and checked their location. They had walked for miles, and still the rain poured down as if some unseen force was pushing it into their path. He looked at the weather forecast on his phone, but there was no connection. The phone was useless now, and the more he tried to access the forecast, the more frustrated he became. "I don't get it," Mark muttered, tapping at the screen. "It said it was supposed to clear up. Why is it just us?" Luke didn't respond, but Mark could feel his unease. The atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer just a storm they were dealing with. It was something else, something unnatural. If on cue, they saw the first hikers coming from the opposite direction. They were clad in bright rain gear, their faces lit with laughter and, strangely, completely dry. "Clear skies ahead," one of them called out cheerfully as they passed. Mark blinked. "What?" The hikers didn't even seem to notice the rain that drenched Mark and Luke. They weren't wet. Not a drop of water clung to their clothes. Mark felt a tightness in his chest, but he quickly shoved it down. There had to be an explanation. Maybe they had just come from the other side of the storm and it hadn't reached them yet. Weird, he muttered to Luke. But Luke didn't respond. His eyes had shifted to the trees, and Mark could tell that his friend was unnerved. They didn't speak much after that. The rain continued to fall without mercy, its cold fingers slipping through the fabric of their jackets and creeping under their skin. They made camp in a small clearing as night fell, the forest now darkening faster than they expected. The sky above them, once a deepening blue, was now an oppressive, impenetrable grey. Mark tried to start a fire. The wood was wet, of course, but it should have caught eventually. He struck the flint, and for a moment a flame flickered, just enough to get the fire going. But the moment the spark took to the wet logs, it sputtered out. He tried again and again, but the fire refused to stay alight. It was as if the very rain was attacking them, working against them in every way possible. Come on, Mark muttered under his breath, his fingers raw and trembling. But the fire refused to stay, the wet logs only hissing and smoking. The night felt colder now, the air growing damp and heavy. He glanced at Luke. His friend was staring into the dark forest, his face pale, a look of confusion, almost fear, etched into his features. "You all right?" Mark asked. Luke nodded slowly but didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, his eyes still fixed on the trees. Mark followed his gaze but saw nothing. Nothing but shadows, stretching across the forest floor, swallowed by the dark. Luke began, but his voice trailed off. The wind shifted, howling through the trees, sending a cold shiver down Mark's spine. And then, something else. A noise, soft at first, barely perceptible, like a distant whisper. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Mark's eyes darted around the clearing. There was no one there. Only the rain. But that whisper grew louder, and Mark's chest tightened as he realized it wasn't the wind. It was coming from the forest. Before he could speak, Luke's voice broke the silence. "Did you hear that?" Mark's heart raced. "Yeah, I hear it." The whisper was low, guttural, something foreign. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't a person. It was something else, something they shouldn't have been hearing. The trees shifted around them. There was something out there, something they couldn't see but could feel. A presence just beyond the veil of the forest, watching them. Suddenly, the compass in Mark's hand spun violently. The needle spun in a complete circle, faster than he could follow, before stopping at an erratic point, never steady. "What the hell is this?" Mark muttered under his breath. Luke, now visibly shaken, turned toward him. "We're not alone out here." But the forest remained still, except for the relentless rain. It wasn't just the storm anymore. Something had followed them, something ancient and unknowable, and it was closing in. Mark's stomach twisted, and a chill ran through him as the shadows around them seemed to deepen. The next morning, the rain had not stopped. The constant downpour continued to soak their clothes, their gear, their very bones. By now, Mark and Luke had long since stopped talking about it. There was no point anymore in questioning the storm. It was just there, like the heavy blanket of silence that had descended on the forest around them. The air was so thick with moisture that every breath felt like sucking in water. They trekked on, their feet slipping in the mud, their steps muffled by the soft, wet ground. The trees seemed closer now, leaning in like silent observers. The deeper they went into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Mark noticed that even the birds had fallen silent. The only sound that accompanied their steps was the soft hiss of the rain and the occasional rustle of leaves as something, perhaps an animal, moved in the underbrush. It was as if the forest itself was watching them, waiting. "We should be out of here by tomorrow," Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. He wiped the water from his face, unable to shake the sense of being trapped. "I thought we'd hit the main trail by now." Luke didn't answer. His mind was elsewhere, his eyes darting constantly between the trees. Mark couldn't blame him. There was something unsettling about the forest now, something that went beyond just the incessant rain. The compass still spun in Mark's pocket, its needle forever indecisive, just like their location. And the GPS, it wasn't much better. It kept shifting their position, showing them as miles away from their intended route, circling over a lake that wasn't on the map. Mark had tried to convince himself it was just a glitch, but after hours of trudging through the muddy trails, he began to feel that familiar, growing knot in his stomach. The storm wasn't just weather, there was something more to it. Something. "Wrong, Luke." Mark's voice faltered, but he forced himself to speak. What if we're lost?" Luke stopped walking. His head jerked up as if hearing the words out loud made them more real. "We're not lost. We're fine," he said, though the lack of certainty in his voice made it clear he didn't fully believe it either. But Mark could tell it was the storm getting to him, just as it was getting to Mark. The silence, the endless rain, it was suffocating, inescapable, and there was something else. Something more troubling than the feeling of being lost. The dry hikers. They had encountered a small group of hikers, heading back in the opposite direction around noon. Mark had seen them from a distance at first. Bright rain jackets, cheerful, waves. But as they drew closer, something felt off. The group of hikers was completely dry. Not a single drop of water clung to their clothes, their backpacks, or their hair. They had the look of people who had just walked out of a warm, sunny day, not a downpour that had lasted for over 24 hours. Mark's first instinct was to ask them how they had managed to stay dry in such a relentless storm. But when he opened his mouth, the words didn't come. There was something about them, their smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, the way they moved with an unsettling smoothness, that made Mark hesitate. It wasn't just their dry clothing that seemed strange. It was everything about them. One of the hikers, a man with a scruffy beard and wide eyes, waved them down. "You guys look like you're getting soaked. You might want to turn back and head for shelter. This storm's not letting up anytime soon. Clear skies ahead." Another hiker called out, his voice too bright, too casual. "You'll be out of the rain in no time." Luke, walking behind Mark, had stiffened at the sight of them. His eyes narrowed, watching the group as they passed. Mark couldn't blame him. There was something about the hikers, something unsettling, like they weren't supposed to be there. The man with the scruffy beard gave them one last glance over his shoulder, his lips curling into a tight, knowing smile before he turned away and rejoined his group. Mark caught Luke's eye and saw the same question reflected there. "How the hell are they dry?" Mark muttered under his breath. Luke didn't respond at first, just shook his head, as if trying to clear the thought. But Mark could see the confusion in his expression, the uncertainty that mirrored his own. "They're not real," Luke whispered suddenly, so softly that Mark almost didn't hear him. "They're not real, Mark. They're not like us." Mark froze. The thought came so suddenly, so violently, that it made his stomach churn. "What do you mean?" But Luke just stared after them, his gaze distant, as though lost in some dark thought he couldn't share. Mark didn't press him further. Instead, they kept walking, the forest pressing in around them like a vice. Every time they came across another dry hiker, the same feeling gnawed at them, the same surreal, unsettling presence. It wasn't just that the hikers were dry, it was their mannerisms, the unnatural ease with which they moved through the storm. It was almost like they were untouchable by it, as if the rain and the storm couldn't even exist in their world. The forest began to grow more ominous with each passing mile, and the sky above was now a relentless grey, as if the storm had spread out to cover the whole world. By mid-afternoon, they had entered a part of the forest that felt different. The trees were older here, their trunks gnarled and twisted like the fingers of some ancient creature. The air was heavier too, thick with the scent of damp decay. They passed another pair of hikers on the trail. This time it was two women, smiling softly as they made their way toward them, and just like the others, they were dry. The rain seemed to slide off their clothes as though they weren't even there. It was as if the storm was afraid of touching them. "Hey, don't let the rain get to you," one of the women said in a light tone, almost sing-song. "There's a lovely little spot up ahead if you want to take cover." Mark stared at her, trying to make sense of the words, but they seemed to slip through his mind like water through a sieve. He didn't even know what to say. How could they be dry? But then, before he could speak, Luke was already turning away. "Thanks," he said quickly, his voice strained. The women gave him a puzzled look but continued on their way, disappearing into the trees. Mark glanced back at Luke, who was shaking his head, his face drawn with a mixture of fear and confusion. "What's wrong with them?" he asked quietly. Luke swallowed hard. "They don't belong here, Mark." Mark wasn't sure what Luke meant by that. But he knew one thing. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't natural. These hikers, the ones who seemed unaffected by the storm, they weren't part of the same world as him and Luke. And that thought, it chilled him to the core. The forest, once a welcoming stretch of nature, now felt more like a trap. The trees had closed in around them, and the whispers of the wind seemed to carry a language they couldn't understand. The storm raged on, relentless and all-encompassing, but still the dry hikers walked on through it with an eerie ease, and each time they passed, Mark could feel his grip on reality loosening just a little more. "Mark," Luke whispered suddenly, his voice sharp, "we need to leave this place." Mark turned to look at him, and for the first time since the rain had begun, he saw the deep, unshakable fear in Luke's eyes. Now. It wasn't just the storm that terrified them now. It was the creeping feeling that whatever force controlled it was watching them, closer than they realized. The rain did not relent. It was as if the heavens themselves were trapped in a state of ceaseless fury, unyielding, unwilling to pause for even a breath. The forest, drenched and heavy with moisture, seemed to groan beneath the weight of the endless downpour. Mark and Luke continued on, the trail ahead growing more treacherous with every step. Their boots squelched in the mud, their pants weighed down with water, and every gust of wind felt like it carried an additional bite, the chill of something ancient creeping through their bones. By the time evening began to settle over the forest, the mood had grown thick with something more than just the weight of the rain. The trees around them seemed to stretch even higher, their branches creaking and twisting in the wind, almost as if they were reaching out to pull them deeper into the forest's heart. Every crack of thunder sent an icy tremor through Mark's chest, as though the sky itself was closing in on them, and the incessant pattering of the rain began to sound like a warning, a drumbeat heralding something far more sinister than the storm. "Let's set up camp here," Mark said, his voice nearly drowned out by the sound of the rain, but Luke didn't respond at first. He had stopped walking, his face a mix of confusion and dread, his eyes scanning the trees with a kind of distant horror. Mark followed his gaze but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The forest, darkened by the impending night, stretched endlessly, in every direction. "We can't just keep going," Mark continued more insistently. "The storm's not going to stop, and we need to find shelter." Luke slowly turned to him, his face pale, his mouth tight. "It's not the storm that's the problem," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "It's the forest. It doesn't want us here." Mark frowned, but before he could respond, Luke stepped forward, his eyes darting over the trees again. Something had changed in his friend. Something more than just the exhaustion and anxiety of being lost in the wilderness. There was a palpable tension in his body now, a nervous energy that Mark couldn't ignore. "We'll figure it out," Mark said, more to convince himself than anything. He grabbed their gear and began pulling out the tarp, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that settled over him. Something was wrong with the forest, that much was certain. But there were still more pressing concerns, like surviving through the night. They set up camp in a small clearing, the trees encircling them like silent sentinels, watching them with unseen eyes. Mark set to work on gathering firewood, trying to push aside the gnawing feeling that had lodged itself deep in his chest. He struck the flint and steel together, but the fire wouldn't catch. It should have. The wood was wet, yes, but not so wet that it should have been impossible to start a fire. Striking the flint again, Mark cursed. The spark briefly flickered, but immediately extinguished, as though the fire was being snuffed out by something invisible. "You try," he said to Luke, his voice strained. Luke stepped forward, his eyes searching the darkened forest around them, as though he feared something was lurking just out of sight. With trembling hands, he struck the flint, but the fire refused to come. Again, the same result, flashes of light followed by immediate darkness. The wood remained stubbornly damp, as though the rain had saturated it beyond all hope. And yet, the rain was still falling, heavier now, as if the storm had decided to push harder, push deeper. Mark frowned. "It's like the fire doesn't want to burn," he muttered. "It's like the forest is stopping it." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The fire was supposed to be their comfort, their protection against the dark, against the unknown. And yet it was failing them, just like the compass had earlier, just like the GPS, just like the hikers who remained untouched by the storm. Nothing here was as it should be. Luke glanced around the clearing nervously, his hand twitching toward his pocket as if seeking some hidden comfort or reassurance that was no longer there. Mark could see the fear growing in his eyes, something deeper than the anxiety of being lost in the forest. It was something else, something primal, an instinctual terror that crawled beneath his skin. "We can't stay here," Luke said suddenly, his voice low and urgent. He began to move, as if trying to put distance between himself and the clearing. Mark stood up quickly, following him. "What are you talking about?" Mark asked, his heart beginning to race. "We need to stay put until we figure out what's going on." But Luke wasn't listening. He was looking past him toward the tree line at the edge of the clearing, his eyes wide, searching. "Luke!" Mark called, grabbing his friend's arm. "What's going on?" Luke's face was pale, his mouth dry, and he spoke in a whisper so soft that Mark had to strain to hear him. "It's them. They're coming closer." "Who?" Mark asked, his pulse quickening. His mind raced to the hikers, the ones who had walked past them earlier. Strangers who didn't belong in the storm. Had they somehow followed them here? But the thought didn't make sense. It couldn't be them. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, carrying with it an unnatural chill. The forest seemed to sigh, a deep resonant sound that made the hairs on the back of Mark's neck stand on end. It was then that Mark heard it, the faintest of noises. At first it was just a whisper, like the rustling of leaves. But it didn't stop. It grew louder. A low, distorted murmur that seemed to emanate from all around them. Mark spun in place, his heart hammering in his chest. The dark shapes at the edge of the clearing, figures moving between the trees, not quite human, not quite anything, were there again. They were standing still, watching, their forms barely visible in the shadows, fading in and out of existence like phantoms. Luke's hand shot out, gripping Mark's arm in a vice-like hold. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, his eyes wide, with terror. They're not just in the trees, they're in the air. They're all around us. Mark's stomach churned. He tried to speak, to make sense of the panic in Luke's voice, but the words caught in his throat. The figures moved, silent and quick, vanishing into the dark forest, reappearing only to vanish again. Mark could feel them, there was no mistaking it, watching, waiting, circling them like animals toying with prey. The feeling of being observed, of being hunted, was suffocating. Mark began, but the words died in his throat. Suddenly, the compass in his pocket began spinning wildly again, the needle twisting in every direction, as if it had lost all sense of orientation. Mark pulled it out, staring at the erratic needle, his mind racing for an explanation. "They know where we are," Luke whispered hoarsely. "They've been following us, watching us." The fire, still unlit, seemed to flicker in the corner of his eye, almost as if the storm itself had taken control of it. The spark, the flame, everything in the forest seemed to be conspiring against them. The unnatural feeling of being trapped deepened, growing more suffocating with every passing second. "I don't know if we can stay here," Mark said finally, his voice trembling. He looked at Luke, his friend's pale face, his terrified eyes. And for the first time since their journey began, he felt the grip of fear tighten around his own chest. They had no shelter, no warmth, and no way of navigating the storm or the dark figures that seemed to move ever closer. "Let's go," Luke whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We can't stay here. We can't stay in this place." But where would they go? The storm, the figures, the unsettling quiet of the forest. There was no safe place left. Mark and Luke stood in the middle of the clearing, the rain pounding down around them, the fire still refusing to catch. And as the forest closed in around them, the figures watching from the trees, the air thick with dread, Mark realized just how deep the darkness had already sunk into their bones. The forest wasn't just a place they were lost in. It was a place that didn't want them to leave. The night seemed to stretch out longer than it should have, the hours bleeding together in a disorienting haze of rain, shadows, and growing dread. The figures in the trees, those twisted shapes that had watched them from the darkness, didn't disappear. They were still there, but now they had become something far worse than mere observers. They had become a presence. Mark could feel their gaze even when he wasn't looking, as if the very air around them thickened, constricting, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. By morning, the rain showed no sign of abating. They hadn't spoken much during the night. There was nothing to say, no comfort to offer each other. The cold seeped into their bones, and the exhaustion was gnawing at them like a hungry animal, but they couldn't stop. Not here. Not with those things in the trees. The storm wouldn't let them rest, and neither would the forest. They packed their gear in silence, the weight of the situation heavy between them. Mark tried again with the compass, hoping for some semblance of normalcy, a direction, anything. That would tell them they weren't entirely lost. He flipped it open, watching the needle swing violently, spinning in a wide arc, as if mocking him. He cursed under his breath and slammed it shut. "What's wrong?" Luke asked, his voice quiet, as if speaking too loudly might invite the figures back. "The compass is broken," Mark muttered, his voice tight. "It won't settle. It's just spinning, like it's confused, like it doesn't know where we are." He shoved it into his pocket, his frustration boiling beneath the surface. The compass, their only lifeline in the wild, had betrayed them. He couldn't understand it. They hadn't been here that long. There should have been no reason for the compass to malfunction, especially not this severely. "I told you, Mark," Luke said, his voice raw. "The forest, it's doing something to us. Something's wrong here. The storm, the hikers, the compass, it's all connected." We're not supposed to be here. Mark clenched his jaw. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew that Luke was right. The longer they stayed in this place, the more it seemed like the very fabric of reality was bending around them, warping into something unrecognizable. The world had become mutable, unpredictable. The rules that governed it had suddenly stopped, making sense. They set off again, moving through the drenched woods in silence. Mark tried to stay focused on the path ahead, though it was difficult. Every step they took felt like they were sinking deeper into a dream they couldn't wake from. A nightmare, where logic no longer applied, and the world itself seemed intent on trapping them. Luke walked beside him, his eyes constantly flicking from side to side, searching the trees for any sign of movement. Mark could see the strain on his face, the tightness in his jaw, the nervous energy that had built up in his movements. He was just as scared as Mark was, but Luke wasn't one to show it. Not unless he had to. "We need to find something. Anything that makes sense," Mark said, trying to sound confident. He hated the way his voice wavered. "We need to find a trail. Something familiar." "Familiar?" Luke asked sharply, turning to face him. "Mark, there's nothing familiar here. Nothing that makes sense. We've passed the same trees twice now, and every time I check the map, it's like we're somewhere else entirely." He swallowed hard, his throat dry. This isn't just the rain. It's not just the storm. This place, this forest, it's wrong. Mark stopped walking, looking at Luke for the first time since the fire refused to light. The desperation in his eyes was impossible to ignore now. "I don't know what's going on anymore," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't think we're getting out of here. Not like this." Luke's eyes darkened. "We have to keep moving," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "We have to." Mark nodded, even though he didn't know where they were going. The path was indistinct now. There were no clear markers, no signs of civilization. The trees had become more twisted, the underbrush thicker, as though they were heading deeper into the heart of something. Something ancient, something waiting. After several more hours of walking, Mark glanced at the GPS on his phone. It was one last thread of hope. It had been useless the night before, showing them drifting over a lake that didn't exist. But maybe, just maybe, it could offer them something. Anything. He tapped the screen, his hands shaking as he held the phone in front of him. The blue dot on the map blinked into view and then froze. It wasn't a lake. It was a vast, empty patch of nothing, a void. He stared at the screen, his heart pounding. The GPS had placed them at the exact center of something that shouldn't be there. There was nothing on the map, no trail, no markers, just a blank space. "Luke," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper, his finger still hovering over the phone screen. "There's nothing here. There's nothing at all." Luke stepped up behind him, peering over his shoulder at the phone. His breath caught in his throat when he saw what Mark was staring at. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Luke muttered, "It's like the world is being erased. We don't even exist on the map." Mark's hands went clammy and his stomach churned. He wanted to shout, to run, to find some kind of refuge, but deep down, he knew that none of it mattered. They were trapped in a place that wasn't even real. And as the rain continued to fall, they were no closer to escaping. Then, as if answering their silent despair, the world shifted again. A flash of lightning illuminated the dark sky, a brilliant white light that lit up the forest in stark contrast. For a brief, terrifying moment, Mark saw something in the trees, figures, pale and unnatural, standing motionless. They were barely visible, barely tangible, as if they were made of smoke, fleeting and ethereal, but Mark saw them nonetheless. His heart skipped a beat as the figures vanished into the shadows, leaving only the flickering afterimage of their presence in the back of his mind. "Did you see that?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. Luke nodded, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "I saw them," he whispered. "They're everywhere now, aren't they?" Mark swallowed hard. The rain seemed to intensify, pouring down like an endless cascade, the sound of it deafening in his ears. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees as if the storm itself had become a living thing. Suddenly, Mark felt an overwhelming sense of vertigo. The trees around them bent in unnatural ways, the world twisting and shifting before his eyes, like the forest was alive, breathing. It was as if the very ground was moving beneath his feet, the trail no longer linear, but looping back on itself, dragging them deeper into the unknown. "Where are we going?" Mark asked, his voice rising in panic. He felt the weight of something pressing down on him, something vast, something ancient, and it was beginning to close in around them. "I don't know," Luke said, his voice distant, "but we can't turn back. We have to keep moving. We can't stop." Mark didn't have the energy to argue. He could feel it too, the compulsion to move, to run, even though it made no sense, even though the storm and the figures and the void on the map told him they were heading straight into a trap. The forest around them seemed to hum with an unseen presence, and Mark's feet moved on their own, guided by something far older than reason. And as they walked deeper into the heart of the forest, Mark realized with a sickening certainty that the compass had been right all along. There was no direction here. The storm wasn't just following them, it was waiting for them. The air had grown thick with dread, and every step they took seemed to carry them deeper into the maw of the forest. The trail, if it could even be called that, had long since vanished beneath the tangled undergrowth, and the trees seemed to stretch higher and higher, their twisted limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers, their bark as black as ink. The storm, far from abating, had grown even fiercer, the relentless downpour now accompanied by gusts of wind that tore through the forest with a haunting wail echoing through the dark woods like the screams of something far worse than a mere storm. Mark's mind felt muddled. The heavy weight of fatigue, the constant downpour, and the growing sense that they were no longer alone had begun to blur the edges of reality. His eyes darted from tree to tree, watching the shifting shadows in the periphery, unsure whether they were caused by the flickering flashes of lightning or something else entirely. He could feel the presence of something, a palpable, suffocating weight that pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. Luke was walking beside him, but his usual calmness was gone, replaced with an uneasy tension. His head was constantly swiveling, scanning the darkened trees with wide eyes, his movements jerky and unnatural. Mark could see the fear etched into his face. There was no mistaking it. They were being watched, and not just by the shadows cast, by the storm. Someone was out there, hidden in the dark, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. "Mark," Luke whispered suddenly, his voice barely audible over the roar of the rain. "Look." Mark followed Luke's gaze to the trees ahead. For a split second, he saw it. Figures, pale and ghostly, standing motionless between the trunks. They were far off, barely visible in the thick, shifting shadows, but there was no mistaking what they were. They were figures, humanoid, but their outlines were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in ways that defied nature. They were nothing like the hikers they had passed earlier. These beings didn't belong in the world they knew. Mark's heart skipped a beat, a jolt of pure terror shooting through him. The figures were watching them, and even though they were standing still, there was an undeniable feeling that they were aware of every movement, every breath Mark and Luke took. "Did you see that?" Mark asked, his voice strained. Luke nodded, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "I saw them. They're in the trees. They're watching us." They've been watching us for hours." The silence that followed was thick with the unspoken knowledge that something was horribly wrong. The rain, still relentless, pounded down on them, but neither of them moved. They were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the weight of what they had just seen, or perhaps by the fear of what would come next. A low, unnatural wind whispered through the branches above them, and for a moment, Mark thought he could hear something else, a soft, eerie rustling, almost like a voice carried on the wind, but too faint to understand. The sound seemed to surround them, coming from all directions, as if the very forest itself was alive, breathing, watching. Mark's skin prickled, with the unmistakable sensation of being observed. Luke took a shaky breath, his eyes flicking nervously from one shadow to another. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice tight with panic. "We need to go. Now." But before Mark could respond, the wind shifted. The figures, those ghostly shapes that had been standing motionless in the trees, began to move. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, as though they were testing the space between them and their prey. Mark's breath hitched in his throat. They were coming closer. Without thinking, Mark grabbed Luke's arm and began to pull him back down the trail, toward what they hoped might be some form of shelter, some sign of escape. But the forest was no longer cooperative. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, the trees closing in tighter, their roots twisting together in a strange, unnatural formation. Mark couldn't see the path anymore. The trees had grown closer, and their shadows had lengthened, suffocating the little light that the flashes of lightning provided. "Mark, stop!" Luke hissed, pulling back on his arm. Mark froze, turning to face his friend. Luke's eyes were wide, his face drained of color. His body was rigid, locked in place, and his hand was trembling as he pointed into the distance toward the trees. Mark followed his gaze, his heart hammering in his chest. There, at the edge of the clearing, standing between the blackened trunks, was one of the figures, the pale, elongated form, but it wasn't just standing anymore. It was moving toward them, taking slow, deliberate steps, its limbs stretching unnaturally, as though its very body was too large for the space it occupied. Mark's throat went dry, and his blood ran cold. He couldn't breathe. The figure was impossibly tall, far taller than any man could be, and its movements were jerky, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. As it stepped closer, Mark saw something else. Its face, if it could even be called that, was a featureless mask of white, smooth and unbroken, save for two black, hollow eyes that seemed to swallow all light. It was watching them, and its presence filled the air with an oppressive weight that was almost unbearable. Luke gasped, his voice trembling. "We need to leave. We need to go now. We have to..." But Mark couldn't move. His legs were frozen, his body locked in place, as though the figure had cast some kind of spell over him, keeping him rooted to the spot. The figure moved closer, its limbs elongating and stretching further as it came. There was no sound as it moved, not a creak of the branches, not the crunch of leaves or twigs underfoot. It was silent, impossible. The air around them began to feel colder, and Mark could see his breath clouding in the air in front of him, despite the humidity and the thick rain. A bitter, rancid smell began to fill the air, like something rotting deep beneath the earth. The stench was overpowering, nauseating, and it made Mark's stomach twist. The figure's eyes, those deep, empty hollows, never left them. They locked onto Mark and Luke with an intensity that made his skin crawl, as though it could see right through them. It was so close now that Mark could feel its presence in every fiber of his being, an almost tangible force that pulled at him like a gravity. Well, and with every step it took, the forest seemed to respond, the shadows deepening and closing in on them, the very trees bending and creaking under its weight. Luke's breathing had become shallow and quick. His eyes darted frantically from the figure to the trees and back again. "Mark, move, please. We need to run." But even as the words left his mouth, Mark couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. It was moving closer, closer still, its limbs stretching further, its body impossibly tall, now towering above them, dwarfing them both. Mark could feel the temperature dropping, the cold creeping into his bones. The figure had come too close, now to be a dream, too close for his mind to deny it. It was real. Then suddenly there was a loud crack, the sound of breaking branches, and the figure was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there at all. The silence that followed was deafening. The rain continued to fall in sheets, the wind still howling through the trees, but the figure was gone. The oppressive presence had lifted, though the feeling of being watched lingered, hanging heavy in the air. Mark stumbled back, his legs weak, and for a moment he could only stare into the shadows, unsure if he had truly seen it, or if it had been a figment of his imagination, a trick of the storm. But Luke's frantic breathing beside him told him it had been real. "We need to go," Luke said again, his voice raw. "Now." Mark nodded, though his body felt like it was made of lead. His feet moved automatically, driven by some primal instinct to escape. But even as they turned and ran through the rain-soaked forest, he knew one thing for sure. They were no longer just lost. They were being hunted. And whatever those figures were, they weren't going to let them leave the forest. The rain was no longer a simple inconvenience. It was a storm of relentless, suffocating force, as if the very sky was pressing down on them. The ground beneath their feet had turned into a slick, treacherous bog, making each step an act of pure willpower. Mark and Luke ran, but their legs felt heavy, each movement slower, as though the forest itself was pulling them back. The trees, dark and looming, closed in around them, the shadows stretching unnaturally, as if the very fabric of the forest was distorting to keep them trapped. They didn't speak as they ran. There was no need. The terror that had settled in their chests, the raw, gnawing fear, rendered any words meaningless. Their hearts pounded in their ears, their breaths ragged and uneven, but there was something more than just fear driving them. Now, something deeper, something primal, like the very air around them was thick with an unspoken warning. You are not meant to leave. As they pushed forward, Mark's mind raced. What had they seen? The figures in the trees, the pale, elongated shapes, the cold, unnatural presence that had surrounded them. What was it? He couldn't make sense of it. He couldn't process it. His mind kept flickering back to the moment when they had seen the figures standing still in the trees, watching them. Then the figure had approached, impossibly tall, its limbs stretching in ways that defied nature. It hadn't spoken, hadn't made a sound, but the feeling it left in its wake was one that Mark would never forget. They passed through the trees like phantoms themselves, barely able to see in the thick gloom. The only light came from the occasional lightning strikes that lit up the forest for a brief moment, illuminating the twisted trunks and gnarled roots, their shadows flickering like dark, hungry shapes. Mark could feel the oppressive weight of the storm pressing in on them, and he knew they weren't alone, not just in the sense of the figures they had seen, but something else, something worse. They had been walking for hours, or maybe only minutes. It was impossible to tell anymore. The boundaries of time and space seemed to be shifting, warping. The very earth beneath their feet felt unstable, as though they were walking on something that wasn't truly there. Mark glanced down at the map on his phone again, but the screen was blank. The GPS, like the compass, had gone wild, showing nothing but an endless void, a vast empty expanse with no discernible landmarks. It was as if the map itself was erasing their existence. Luke, panting beside him, grabbed his arm. "Mark," he whispered urgently. "Look." Mark turned to him, his heart already hammering. Luke's eyes were wide, his face pale, and his finger was trembling as he pointed toward the trees. In the distance, barely visible through the rain and mist, something was moving. It was too far to make out clearly, but Mark could see it. Something dark, something looming, and it was moving slowly, deliberately, as though it were watching them. For a moment, Mark thought it might be another of those tall, distorted figures, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized it was something else entirely. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a shape. Familiar, yet wrong. It was a man, but not like any man Mark had ever seen. His features were distorted, stretched as though they had been warped by some unseen force. His skin was pale and almost translucent, his eyes black as coal, with deep, empty hollows that seemed to pull in all the light around them. He was standing still, as if waiting for something, waiting for them. Mark felt a shiver crawl down his spine. His legs refused to move, frozen by a terror so deep, so primal, that he couldn't even form a thought. The man, if it could even be called that, didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there watching them, as if he were a fixture of the forest itself. "Mark!" Luke's voice was shaking now, barely a whisper. "That's him." Mark looked at him, but Luke's eyes were fixed on the figure, his face a mix of dread and recognition. What are you talking about?" Mark asked, though the words felt hollow, as though they were falling from his mouth without meaning. "That's him," Luke repeated, his voice trembling. "The one we're supposed to find." The words didn't make sense. Mark shook his head. "What do you mean? Who is he?" But Luke didn't respond. His gaze was locked on the figure, and Mark followed his eyes, unable to tear his own away. The figure stepped forward, its movement slow, deliberate, as if every motion were meant to amplify the sense of inevitability that was closing in on them. Mark felt a wave of nausea wash over him, his mind racing to make sense of the impossible. Then, as the figure took another step forward, something strange happened. The forest shifted. The trees seemed to bend, their roots twisting in ways that couldn't be real. The air thickened, became stifling, and Mark suddenly felt like he was trapped in some kind of nightmare, where reality no longer existed and the very world was closing in around him. The figure stepped closer, closer still, and then it spoke. The voice came not from its mouth, but from everywhere, from the ground beneath them, the trees, the air itself. It was a voice that felt ancient, timeless, hollow, and it sent an icy chill through Mark's chest. "You should not have come," the voice intoned, low and echoing, resonating with a strange power that seemed to make the very air hum. "You have awakened what was never meant to be awakened." Mark's heart slammed into his ribs, his breath caught in his throat. He wanted to run, he wanted to scream, but his body wouldn't obey. The figure's black, hollow eyes locked onto his, and for the briefest of moments, Mark felt like he was falling into those eyes, falling into a void that had no bottom, no end. "You are in the wrong place," the figure continued, its voice reverberating in Mark's skull, making his thoughts spin, his senses disorienting. "You walked into the forest's grasp, and now you will stay. Forever." Mark's mind raced. "No," he breathed, though it felt like the words were being sucked from him, as though the very forest was swallowing him whole. "No, this can't be real." The figure took another step forward, its elongated limbs reaching out, and the world seemed to tremble in response. "You are not meant to leave. You never were," the voice whispered, closer now, its cold breath brushing against Mark's skin. Suddenly, everything snapped into focus, everything clicked. The storm, the hikers, the compass, the lake that didn't exist on the map, the storm that followed them, the twisted trees. The unnatural darkness of the forest. It had all been a lie, a trap, carefully laid for them. The figures, the distorted figures, they weren't separate from the forest. They were the forest. They were its guardians, its ancient sentinels. And Mark and Luke, they had walked right into it. Mark's pulse quickened, realization crashing into him like a wave. The forest had been waiting for them, drawing them in, leading them down the path they could never escape. They had been brought here for a reason. They weren't just lost. They had been chosen. The forest had called them, and now they were part of its endless, dark history. No, Mark whispered, shaking his head. No, we're not staying here. We're leaving. But as he turned to run, the path had vanished. The trees had closed in, and the very ground beneath their feet seemed to have shifted. There was no way out, no escape. The forest had claimed them, and now it would not let them go. The figure stepped forward one last time, and as it did, everything went silent. The rain stopped, the wind ceased. The world was frozen in place, suspended in an eternal moment of stillness. And then, with a final chilling whisper, the figure spoke. "You are ours now." Mark felt the darkness close in, the storm of the forest swallowing them whole. The last thing he saw was the endless void of the figure's black eyes, pulling him into the depths of the forest where there would be no escape, where they would never be found. The forest had swallowed them whole, and the world as Mark and Luke knew it had ceased to exist. Time, once so reliable and tangible, had lost all meaning in this place. The rain, which had once been a nuisance, was now a constant, oppressive presence, like 1,000 voices whispering through the trees. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the smell of decay, the earthy, rotting scent of ancient things, clung to everything, to their skin, to their clothes, to their very souls. Mark's heart beat like a drum in his chest, pounding harder with each passing second. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind spinning with disbelief. He had always believed in the rational, in logic, in science, but none of that made sense here. None of it applied. The figure had vanished into the shadows, but Mark could still feel it. The weight of its gaze, its voice echoing in his ears, haunted him with every step. "You are ours now." Luke's breathing was shallow beside him, and Mark could feel the fear radiating off his friend, the same fear that was now consuming him too. They were trapped, not in the sense of being lost in the woods, but trapped in a place that wasn't bound by the rules of the world they knew. This place, this forest, was alive in ways that no living thing should be. And worse still, it had already decided their fate. The path beneath their feet had long since dissolved into the endless tangle of gnarled roots and thick underbrush. There was no direction now, no map, no compass, no guidance. They were simply moving through a world that didn't seem to belong to any dimension they understood. Suddenly, the rain intensified, pouring down in torrents, drenching them in seconds. The air grew colder, biting through their damp clothes like ice. Mark glanced over at Luke, who was walking beside him, his eyes wide, his face pale. "Luke," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible against the roar of the storm. "We have to keep going." Luke didn't respond, but Mark could see the silent acknowledgement in his eyes. They both knew there was no choice. There was nothing left but forward. They stumbled through the underbrush, the trees closing in tighter with each step. The feeling of being hunted was growing stronger, like something was watching them, always just out of sight. It wasn't just the figures in the trees. It was the forest itself, the oppressive, heavy presence of it. And then, as though it had been waiting for them to reach the heart of the storm, the ground beneath their feet shifted. Mark felt it first, an odd vibration, a trembling in the earth, like the heartbeat of the forest itself. The air grew heavier still, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on them, compressing their lungs, stealing their breath. Without warning, the rain stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the storm. The world around them felt wrong. The trees seemed to stretch up endlessly, their twisted branches blocking out the sky, leaving them in a twilight haze. The earth was still, unnaturally still, and the air was thick with something that felt ancient, as though they had crossed a threshold into a place that had never known light. Mark turned to Luke, his heart pounding in his chest, but his friend was staring ahead, his eyes locked onto something in the distance, something Mark couldn't see. His mouth was moving, though no sound came from him. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. But Luke didn't answer. Mark's pulse quickened as he followed Luke's gaze, his eyes searching the shadowed space between the trees. There, at the edge of their vision, he saw it. Something flickering in the gloom. It was like a faint, shifting light, a pale glow that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Without thinking, Mark began to move toward it, his legs heavy, his movements sluggish. It wasn't the desire to escape that pushed him forward now. It was something more instinctual, something that had taken hold of his very being. He needed to see it. He needed to understand it. "Luke," he whispered again. But his friend remained frozen, his face pale, his eyes wide. "We need to go." But Luke's eyes were fixed ahead, and Mark knew. He knew they were already too far gone. The light pulsed again, drawing Mark toward it like a moth to a flame. He couldn't explain why, but it felt like something was calling him. Something deep within the forest, something ancient and unholy, was waiting for them. As he moved closer, the trees around him seemed to bend inward, their gnarled branches reaching down like hands, fingers too long, too twisted. The forest had changed. It was no longer just a place. It was alive, conscious, aware of them, aware of their fear, their confusion, their desperate need for escape. Mark reached the source of the pale light. It was a tree, or at least it used to be. Its trunk was twisted and blackened as though it had been struck by some terrible force long ago. The bark was smooth, almost like polished bone, and at its base was a hollow, a dark cavity that seemed to pulse with an eerie light, glowing faintly from within. The air around it vibrated, humming with a low, unnatural energy. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the hollow. It was not just a tree. It was alive. The glowing light pulsed in time with something inside the tree. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. A sound, soft, almost inaudible, came from deep within the hollow, like a whisper. Mark leaned in closer, instinctively reaching out to touch it, but Luke's voice cut through the air, sharp and "Panicked! Don't touch it!" Mark froze, his hand hovering just above the dark opening. He turned to look at Luke, who was standing a few feet away, his face stricken with terror. His body trembled violently, his eyes wide with fear, and for the first time since the storm had begun, Luke looked broken. "Luke?" Mark asked, his voice tight, unsure. "What's going on? What is it?" Luke's voice was barely a whisper. "It's the heart of the storm. The source." Mark blinked, confusion washing over him. "What do you mean? This is just a tree." "No," Luke said, his voice shaking. "It's not just a tree. It's the heart of the forest, Mark. It's the center of everything. The storm, the figures, the rain, they're all connected to it. It's feeding on us." Mark's stomach dropped as the pieces began to fall into place. The storm, the figures, the compass, the lake that didn't exist. The forest had been drawing them in, guiding them toward this place. The storm hadn't just been following them, it had been leading them, pulling them toward the heart of the forest, and now they were here. Luke stepped forward, his eyes wild with desperation. "We need to leave. We need to get out of here." Now. But as Mark turned to run, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble again. The trees around them groaned, as if awakening from some deep slumber. The air thickened, pressing down on them like a vice, and the glowing light from the hollow flickered, brighter now, as if feeding on their fear, on their desperation. Mark's legs went numb as the world around him began to warp. The very trees, twisted and bent, their forms stretching in unnatural ways. The air was thick with the presence of something ancient and terrible, something that had been waiting for centuries, waiting for them. As the storm's heart pulsed once more, Mark realized with sickening certainty that there was no escaping. They were trapped in the forest's grasp, and there was no way out. The storm had them. The forest had them. And as the darkness closed in, he understood that it would never let them go. They were part of the forest now. The last thing Mark saw, before the world collapsed into shadows, was Luke's terrified face, and the terrible realization that they had both become nothing more than prey to something far older than time itself. And the forest, now alive with an energy that pulsed through, its very roots consumed them. The forest was silent now. The thunderous storm that had raged for days was gone, vanishing as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a stillness that was almost unnatural in its perfection. The rain, which had soaked them to the bone for what seemed like an eternity, had stopped, and now the air was thick with a heavy, suffocating calm. The trees, once swaying violently in the wind, now stood like silent sentinels, their twisted limbs reaching skyward, as if in prayer to some ancient forgotten god. Mark could feel the weight of the forest's presence around him, its suffocating embrace tightening with every breath he took. It was as if the very air had become thick with something else, something alive, pressing down on him, watching him. He tried to move, but his body felt as though it had been anchored in place by invisible hands. The ground beneath his feet was solid, too solid. It wasn't just earth anymore. It was something more, something wrong. He turned to look at Luke, who was standing beside him, his face pale, his eyes hollow with the terror that had settled deep in their bones. His friend had always been the stronger one, the calm one in moments of crisis. But now, even Luke was shaking, his body trembling, with the kind of fear Mark had never seen before. What is this place?" Mark whispered, his voice hoarse. The words felt too loud in the thick silence that surrounded them, as though the forest itself was listening to every syllable they spoke. But it didn't matter. There was no escaping the truth now. The forest knew them. It had known them from the very beginning, pulling them deeper into its clutches, guiding them toward this moment. The storm had not just been weather, it had been a force, a living thing driving them toward the heart of the forest. And the figures, the pale, twisted beings they had seen in the trees, weren't just watchers. They were its guardians, its eyes, its hands. The forest fed on fear, on isolation, on the very essence of those foolish enough to wander too far into its depths. Luke's voice was barely audible, trembling with something more than just fear. "It's too late. Mark, we're part of it now." Mark felt his heart skip a beat. He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't. But the words were true, weren't they? The forest had swallowed them whole, drawn them into its web. The storm had been a test, a means to break them down, to isolate them, to make them aware. And now, standing here, in the heart of it all, Mark understood the sickening reality of their situation. There was no escape. "Part of it?" Mark repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean? What's happening to us?" Luke's eyes darted toward the dark, gnarled tree, the hollow that had pulsed with that faint, eerie glow. It was still there, looming over them, its twisted roots writhing beneath the surface of the earth like veins, like something alive, something that fed. The glowing light had dimmed, but Mark could feel its pull, a magnetic force that seemed to draw his very soul toward it. He couldn't explain why, but the very sight of it made his skin crawl. "We're part of it," Luke repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "The forest takes what it needs. It consumes those who wander too deep, those who disturb its peace. The storm, the figures, the rain, they were just a part of the process. A ceremony." His words were strained, his eyes wide with terror. "We didn't just walk into the forest, Mark. We entered it. And now we can never leave." Mark's breath hitched in his throat as the weight of Luke's words sank in. He wouldn't believe it. But the evidence was right before his eyes. The storm had followed them. The forest had drawn them in. And now, it was changing them. He could feel it, deep inside. His thoughts were slipping away, his mind clouded, as though the forest itself was rewiring his very essence. The ground trembled beneath them once more, sending a sharp jolt through Mark's legs. The trees groaned, their trunks twisting unnaturally, as though they were alive. The hollow in the tree pulsed again, the light within flickering to life, as though it had been awakened from a long, deep slumber. And then, for the first time since the storm had begun, the air grew cold, bitterly cold, like a breath from the grave. Mark's eyes widened in horror as he watched the branches of the trees shift. Someone was moving through the darkness, walking between the trunks. Tall, impossibly tall figures emerged from the shadows, their limbs stretching unnaturally, their faces blank slates, devoid of expression. They were not human, not entirely, but they were familiar. He could feel the connection, the way they belonged here, as if they had always been here watching. "Luke," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. What are they?" Luke didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on the figures, his body frozen in place, as if he had already accepted his fate. And then, from the depths of the hollow tree, the voice came again. Low, deep, resonating through Mark's very bones. It was the same voice they had heard before, but now it was clearer, louder, as though it was speaking directly into their minds. "You have come," the voice intoned, "and now you will stay." Mark's heart raced. He could feel it. Something ancient, something dark, rising from within the forest. The ground beneath them seemed to pulse in time with the voice, the very air vibrating with a power that sent his senses spinning. The figures stepped forward, their limbs extending impossibly long, as if they were no longer bound by the laws of nature. They were the forest itself, its spirit, its life, its hunger. "You will never leave," the voice continued, echoing through the trees. "You are part of this now. You belong to the forest. The storm was merely the beginning." The final step. Mark tried to scream, tried to run, but his legs were like stone, his feet rooted to the earth. The figures were closing in, their eyes hollow, empty. He could feel the cold creeping up his spine, could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on him, smothering him. The hollow in the tree pulsed once more, its light flickering with an intensity that burned through his soul. And then Mark understood. The forest had not been following them. It had been calling them. It had been waiting for them to cross its threshold, to step into its world, to become part of its endless cycle of life and death. The storm, the rain, the figures, it had all been part of the process. A process older than time itself, a ritual of sorts, and now Mark and Luke were its newest victims, its newest children. The cold deepened, sinking into his very bones. His vision blurred, his thoughts scattered, and the ground beneath him shifted once more. He could feel himself sinking, could feel the roots of the trees creeping around his ankles, pulling him down into the earth. "Luke," Mark whispered, his voice breaking. But Luke was already gone, lost to the forest, lost to the storm. The figures were close now. Mark could feel their hands, long skeletal fingers pressing against his skin. The coldness that filled his chest spread, and he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he would never leave this place. The forest had claimed him. He had become part of it, just like the storm, just like the rain, just like the hollow tree that pulsed with life. The storm, the figures, the eternal darkness, they were all his now. And as the forest consumed him, Mark's last thought, the final fragment of his shattered mind, was that the forest was never really lost. It had simply been waiting for them to find it. And now, it was their home forever. The final pulse of the Storm's heart echoed through the trees, and the world went